our foreign relations, our justice system, our governance, our international competitiveness, our education, our world class festivals and entertainment, sports, politics, regional cooperation, and much more. Globally positioning Dominica within the
Hello, everybody. Good evening, all, and a very, very warm welcome to you in Radio Land, in the internet world, at home and abroad. Thank you for choosing Q95. This is the Global View, and a very warm welcome to all of our Q family listeners at home and globally. I'm Sheridan, Gregoire, Mr. G. It's Tuesday, June 20, 2023, the 25th Tuesday of 2023, and it's 8:02 p.m. at Q95, the big station. We're live on Facebook and YouTube. Follow us at Q95 FM Radio. The on-air phone numbers are on our website, on the homepage of our website at www.q95da.com. Please share the live, like our pages, get the latest breaking news and reviews as it happens, when it happens, only on Q95, the big station. We are, as usual, continuing to revive the spirit of graciousness, of love and peace and prosperity and unity among our Kalinago and Afro-Caribbean brothers and sisters. But tonight, we'll tell it like it is, and there is a lot to tell. I lay out a few talking points, and we delve into the details as we get into the conversation there. We will demystify Sir Dennis Byron's final report on electoral and campaign finance reforms and the recommended draft laws contained in it, like the House of Assembly Elections Bill 2023, the House of Assembly Electors Regulations, the House of Assembly Election Petition Rules 2023, and the Electoral Commission Bill 2023. But here are some questions. Is this so-called electoral reform the prophecy of gloom and doom? Do Dominicans need to feel repulsed by what may be brewing? Is this the curse that will destroy Dominica? And if so, what is the cure that can save our nature island? Justice Dr. Irving and UW Lennox Linton and former Dominica Ambassador Crispin Gregoire will provide the analysis to see whether or not Sir Dennis Byron's recommendations and draft laws square up with what right-thinking Dominicans want in revised electoral and campaign finance laws and for a reconstituted electoral commission. So let's see whether Sir Dennis Byron's recommendations measure up to a few things and what possibly a petition signed by maybe 10,000 or more Dominicans might contain. These are some of my own points I'm putting in here. I'll expect that my guests, my distinguished guests, will have their own. One, a complete re-registration of the electors right here in Dominica to ensure a cleansed voters list with no dead people and non-residents on them. Only Dominicans who reside in Dominica are in that voters list. That campaign contributions are limited to a maximum of $50 per constituent to any candidate in any constituency. A maximum, number four, a maximum of $1,500 EC from any Dominican corporate entity to any party candidate. Five, no financial contributions from any foreign corporate entity or individual to any party candidate. Somebody has their mic open. Could you please close it so we don't get the feedback? The campaign period should be no more than 90 days prior to election day. No campaign funds should be obtained or spent prior to the said 90-day campaign period. Number eight, all campaign funds received and spent must be reported to the Electoral Commission within 1 week after election day. Number nine, that any breach of the electoral and campaign finance laws and or regulations by any candidate shall be punishable by disqualifying any such candidate. Any infringement of the electoral and campaign finance laws or regulations by any member of the Electoral Commission shall be punishable by lifelong disqualification of that member from serving on the Commission or any other government institution. Number 11, that the Electoral Commission shall be reconstituted to include representation from civil society organizations. Number 12, equal access to be given to all media houses in Dominica, to all legitimate political parties on the island at normal fees. Number 13, voter ID cards with biometric data should be issued to every re-registered elector. Number 14, the chief elections official shall carry out all of the functions mandated under the laws and regulations without fear or favor. And then number 15, I'm suggesting there should be 3 debates between political party leaders. These are some of the things that I myself would like to see embedded in our laws and regulations. And hopefully that might help. I'm sure that my distinguished guests will have their own ideas and suggestions. But we will make the case for tonight, we will make the case for ensuring that the people of Dominica get the right reforms in the legislation that goes to the parliament to ensure a level playing field for free and fair elections, to fortify Dominica's democracy. And I'm sure that my distinguished guest, Justice Dr. Irving, ULP President Lennox Linton, and former Dominican Ambassador Crispin Gregoire will help us unravel and demystify these imperatives for reformed electoral and campaign finance laws and regulations. I'm pretty sure that you will only hear this level of complete, unbiased, untainted electoral reform analysis on Q95, nowhere else, only on the big station. So wherever you are in Dominica, in the region and globally, tell your friends and associates, please tune in, call in and join the conversation, get the answers to your questions and be part of the solution. And as usual, a huge shout out, hugs, much love, appreciation, a big thank you to healthcare providers, frontline workers, police, fire officers, teachers, doctors, nurses, and other public and private sector persons. We welcome every Dominican and friend of Dominica. We embrace you wherever you are tonight, in every nook and cranny, in every village, in every community in Dominica, in the region and globally. Thank you again, Sherwin, keeping us on the air. Thank you, Lambi, on the console at Q95 tonight, directing the traffic. We will take your calls a little later. But the people's voice is a priority tonight, so please call us. So let's get started. I go now to Justice Dr. Irving to get the ball rolling tonight on demystifying Sir Dennis Byron's final report on electoral and campaign finance reforms and the recommended draft laws contained in it, and on the best way forward to get this much needed specific recommendations implemented in the revised electoral and campaign finance laws and regulations so as to ensure free and fair elections to sustain our democracy and to take the people of Dominica out of the dilemma of what appears to be a never-ending cycle of poverty and in some cases mendicancy that we are witnessing. So you get the first word, Dr. Andre, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. G. Let me thank the fellow panelists, Mr. Linton, Mr. Crispin, Gregoire, Mr. Lambi, and DJ Slim, your listeners, and all those who are listening, irrespective of their motivation to do so. And let us always remember that despite all the adversities, it is a day the Lord has made, so we must be happy and we must rejoice. But let me start my little presentation by invoking the memory of former Premier Edward Oliver LeBlanc, by quoting to some extent one of his favorite biblical passages, and it's actually in Ecclesiastics, verse 3-7. And in it, the good book says, quote, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to reset, a time to keep silent and a time to speak." Obviously, I'm paraphrasing what's indicated in the book. A time to reflect, perhaps, on the life and times of this great and proud man, a man who sought to preserve the beaches for all his people, a man who provided jobs to qualified Dominicans even before they returned to Dominica, a man who had a justifiable suspicion and distrust of fly-by-night investors, a man who rejected the belief that holding public office should be the means of becoming filthy rich, a man who built the wealth of farmers, a man who refused offers of expensive shirts from a businessman on the ground that he only had one back, a man who believed that he should only serve 2 consecutive terms in office and only return at the behest of the people, a man who believed that Dominicans should be treated as equals in their own land, a man who left office with less than $100 in savings in his bank account, a man who rejected the offer of the presidency after Dominica attained independence, a man short in stature, tall in conviction, one who stood toe to toe with the Goliaths of poverty, color and class prejudice, and greed. A man who, when confronted by these vices, did not sing in the woods of the mighty sparrow, Sasa ye, Monsieur Ukachwe Mwen. The failure to enact true electoral reform spells the death knell of these cherished values that have served Dominicans so well since the early 60s. Indeed, the bells of doom began to toll hauntingly but persistently, even as hundreds of mourners gathered in Vacas following the death of Mr. Leblanc on about October 29, 2004. While mourners lowered their heads in respectful and reverential silence, many of those who had turned their backs first on Rosie and then on Pierre Charles publicly vowed, even as the casket of honesty, integrity, and decency was being lowered into the ground, and even as mourners wept in sorrow, that they would not leave office with no more than the clothes on their backs. This philosophy of prosperity plunder has now been fulfilled. The local legal infrastructure is now being put in place to ensure that this prophecy continues. And so we must look at these proposed reforms and ask ourselves dispassionately, how do they preserve, perpetuate, prolong this prophecy of plunder and prosperity that has cursed the nation since 2004? This is therefore a time not to remain silent, but a time to speak, a time not just to talk, but a time to walk in freedom according to Psalm 119, verse 46, to ask for the good way and walk in it according to Proverbs 6-16, to walk through the darkest valley, fearing no evil according to Psalm 23, to walk in the light rather than in the darkness according to John 8:12. And so let us walk through this desolate valley of reforms and seek what perils, what precipices, what piranhas and poison chalices look ominously to fulfill this prophecy of plunder and prosperity that has ambushed our democracy and way of life. I will address the following issues in the final report or solution to our democracy. 1, financial contributions. 2, campaign expenditure. 3, electoral expenses. 4, the Electoral Commission. 5, financial autonomy of the Commission. The report calls for a prohibition against quote-unquote impermissible contributors. These include, according to Sir Byron, foreign governments, public bodies, and persons involved in illegal activities. It recommends that such contributions should be returned within 15 days of receipt. But who would police these provisions? Who is going to ensure that those who believe that no law or constitution can stop them will comply with these provisions? Who will ensure that where the Labour Party get their funds from is not your damn business? Are these the persons who will ensure compliance with these provisions? Campaign finance. Limits are placed on spending within a defined reporting period, but there are no limitations with respect to spending outside or before that reporting period. In other words, a party who has money hidden in mysterious accounts in Europe can spend millions and millions of dollars prior to that reporting period. And when the date of the election is proclaimed as if by magic, or perhaps from some rogue pastor, you have all the paraphernalia of elections just springing forth a day or two after the reporting period commences. This is a significant loophole in what Sir Byron is proposing, one that will make mockery of any proposal he makes with respect to limits on campaign financing. The report also indicates the following. It placed a party must submit a report of election expenditure to the commission within a defined period after the election. The commission has the power to require a party or candidate to submit documents relating to any expenditure, and the party or candidate will be required to comply with the request. Parties and candidates must provide proper records and a final disclosure report to the Commission detailing all income and expenditure during the reporting period. Oh, it sounds so beautiful. What a lovely piece of legal scholarship in defining the obligations of a party reporting expenditure. Now, let me ask you this. Whatever happened, because I don't know, Mr. G, whatever happened to the integrity in public office a few years ago when they served notice that it intended to investigate the political directorate to ensure compliance with integrity in legislation, to ensure that their assets are not incongruent with their known means of income? Whatever happened to it? Is that the proof that we need regarding compliance with any reporting of campaign expenditure? Now, I wonder if the government would provide financial records of the passages paid for persons to travel to Dominica to vote, the money used to bribe voters, the money paid to reggae and religious mercenaries for election purposes. Are you telling me that these folk are going to provide, in compliance with these proposed reforms, expenditure or reports showing the expenditure made even prior to the reporting period? It will not happen. Don't fool ourselves. What about election offenses? Now, I've had occasion to comment on the proposed amendments or the proposed reforms with respect to election offenses. Now, these in the final report, as I understand, it states that it does not specifically it states that bribery and treating are offenses, election offenses. The provisions state that providing persons with food, with drink and entertainment with the intent to have them vote for you constitutes evidence of these offenses. But nowhere in this report is there any mention of air or sea travel. Not a single mention. Now, Sir Byron writes that a text called the Halesbury Laws of England clearly state that the purpose or the promise or the payment to a voter of his or her traveling expenses with the intent of making the person vote for him or her is bribery. He therefore concludes, listen carefully, I have not been able to share the view that the definition of treating need clarification or expansion. Papanoste. Sir Byron is saying he doesn't believe that the definition of bribery and treating as he proposes require any expansion or clarification. What he fails to tell us is why he has refused explicitly to state that payment or a promise to pay the travel expenses of a person on condition that he or she vote for the person doing the paying constitutes bribery or treating. Why? After all, there are a number of reported criminal cases which state unequivocally that giving a prospective voter a free pass, travel, or ticket by railway, boat, or other means of transportation for the purpose of having the person vote for you or for your party is a criminal offense. So Byron would therefore be on solid legal grounds to say so explicitly in his final report. Mais pas fait. Why? Why is Sir Byron so hesitant and reluctant to specifically indicate that paying for the passage, air or sea travel of a prospective voter with one clear intention, and we know the intention because the clear, uncontradicted evidence is that dozens or hundreds of persons were not only provided with free passage, they were given specific instructions to vote in a particular constituency. So the evidence is there. Make Assam Sir Byron a vague. He cannot see. And this is a deliberate, cynical attempt to come to the assistance and to provide support to the directorate. That is the only reasonable and logical conclusion. What does Sue Byron say about the Electoral Commission? He correctly notes that it has 5 members. The president appoints the chairman in his own deliberate judgment, whatever that means. The president also appoints 2 members acting on the advice of the PM and another 2 acting on the advice of the leader of the opposition. He says that to create a more independent body, he recommends expanding the commission to include representation from civil society, i.e., academia, religion, business, and at least 1 member who is a woman. He also recommends that the commission should have power to appoint committees when or where necessary. But, Sue Byron, who is going to do the appointing? Who is going to appoint one of those leaders? The president? The one who appointed the current chairman of the commission? Or the same president acting on the advice of the PM or political leader? How would these proposals create a more transparent and independent electoral commission? They would not. How would they do so where there is incontrovertible evidence that those appointed to senior government positions, the head of institutions, the head of boards, have to show that their favorite color is red? Again, this recommendation is not worth the paper on which it was written. Second, who is going to be appointed in terms of religious leaders? Pastor Rodney, perhaps? Monsignor John Lewis? Or would it be the head of the state college? The head of Jungle Bay? Do you think Suki will be appointed on this independent commission? Tongue in cheek, no pun intended. Financial autonomy. What does he say about financial autonomy? His report makes some proposals regarding the independence of the financial affairs of the commission. Rather than sending the commission's budget to the Minister of Finance, Sir Byron proposes, it should be presented to and implemented by Parliament. The funds will be deposited, he suggests, into an account managed by appointed officials, which would include the Chief Elections Officer, the Chairman of the Electoral Commission, with oversight by the Director of Audit. So, Byron, as somebody said to me in the market some time ago, garçon ou pas faible. There is no air of reality to that submission or recommendation. You mean to say that the Chief Electoral Officer or the Chairman of the Commission should be guarding the cage where the little pullets of money of the Commission are being kept to make it independent? Is that what we're being told? What, hypothetically, if the chairman of the commission is a passport seller? Do you honestly think that he will act in any meaningful way to make the commission independent, thereby threatening the election's legacy of the political directorate? Anyway, so Byron, if the chairman is a passport seller, how can you expect him to fulfill that function? If the chief elections officer has not even cleaned the voters list while singing "Shepherd me, O Lord, beyond my wants," how can you expect him to zealously guard the independence of the commission? Hey, lass, the solution to electoral reform lies not with this report from Sir Byron. It lies with the many reports from civic-minded groups, from international NGOs, either from the Caribbean or from the international community, regarding what true electoral reforms, what they look like. That is what we need. And it is up to Dominicans to agitate for and to seek true electoral reform, rather than a cynical template issued by the Lord on high, giving the government carte blanche to run elections in the same way that they've been run over the last 20 years, that will bring us nothing but heartbreak. All it will do is to prolong the prophecy of plunder and greed. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Andre, for your initial remarks on this. Highly appreciated. Lennox, as I go to you for your opening remarks, I'm sure you took a few notes on some of the comments made by Dr. Andre. And the question is accountability and who's going to really implement, and what happened to the IPO when they tried to implement something, the law, right? Because here's why I say that, because I'm sure that, like you, I have seen a copy of a letter that Sir Byron wrote to Prime Minister, addressed to Prime Minister Skerrit, and yeah, I saw the way the letter was written. It certainly was written in a way that was totally different from the way the letters were written to the leader of the opposition and to yourself and to Mr. Dr. Thompson Fontaine and so on and other groups. And when I look at the wording and the phrases and the almost like, it's like almost making excuses and, I beg your pardon for having to say that, like kind of thing. I'm wondering really what is this exercise all about? And as Dr. Andreas said, if we look to that report, I mean, this thing has not got any specifics that make sense that are going to solve the problems that we've had and some of the problems that were noted by the CCJ. And when you think about it, as Dr. Andreas said, Sir Byron has access to all of these cases, just case law, precedents. And he was a member of the CCJ. He knows what the CCJ's position is. Lennox, maybe you can help us now with, like I know you've been following all of that, and also you've taken a look at those the reports 1 and 2. Some of the recommendations contained there. Your thoughts? Your mic, you need to open your mic, huh?
Yeah, thank you, Sheridan. Thanks for the invite. Crispin, Gregoire, welcome. Good to see you. Dr. Andre, good to see you again. Are you still in Dominica? Oh, no, that curtain doesn't look like Dominica. It's okay. That backdrop looks like Brampton, somewhere in Ontario. That'll be good night. God bless. Sheridan, I wanted to, you segued into this talking about the Caribbean Court of Justice. In fact, I want to remind us where we were while this assignment was taking place. The Caribbean Court of Justice was underlining the necessity for electoral reform in Dominica. July of 2022, when it said, quote, "There remain areas of grave concern about how the process of these 2019 elections was conducted. Future elections in Dominica ought not to proceed with these or similar taints." And then in December of 2022, following the public announcement of a plan to implement electoral reform recommendations, we had a sham election boycotted by 70% of the electorate with the same tainted electoral process. And in respect of that election, the OAS Observer Mission advised, quote again here, "It is clear that Dominica cannot proceed to another election under the current rules. It will therefore be essential to have a new electoral framework in place before the next poll." Now, the CCJ didn't only tell us that we should avoid going to another election with the tainted electoral process that they observed with respect to the 2019 election. The CCJ also reminded us, and I'm quoting here from paragraph 7 of the July 2022 judgment, quote, "Without such free and fair elections, the preambular value of the creation and maintenance of and respect for lawfully constituted authority would be fatally undermined. The consequences of such a denial that a reflection on Caribbean history demonstrates include loss of legitimacy, public unrest, and even revolt. In contemporary terms, free and fair elections are so fundamental to the democratic way of life that without it, the very legitimacy and sovereignty of the constitutional state is brought into question, constituted as it is by the people of Dominica. In this regard, it is worth reminding ourselves the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority, the legitimacy of government. And having said that, Sheridan, I want to focus on an aspect of the Dennis Byron report, which I think provides Dominica with a litmus test on the integrity of the work that was done, and whether or not that work was done in the public interest or whether it was done in the interest of one man who has had his designs on the electoral process for a number of years now and who has worked overtime to protect what is referred to as his re-election legacy. The draft Phase 1 report of Sir Dennis Byron in November 2022 deals with the importance of voter identification cards in the electoral reform process. I quote from that draft Phase 1 report, where Sir Dennis Byron says, "The introduction of voter identification cards to persons registered as electors supported with biometric data was considered one of the most important reforms by almost everyone. This was regarded as essential to eliminate or minimize a wide variety of fraudulent conduct at elections, including impersonation and multiple voting. The issue of these voter ID cards has been mandated by Clause 11 of the Registration of Electors Bill. The process details are to be found in the regulations," end of quote. And then in his final Phase 1 report, the legal luminary, the internationally acclaimed jurist, Sir Dennis Byron, made a dramatic shift from voter identification cards to national identification cards, about which there was already a huge public furor. And he claimed that he was moving from voter identification cards to national identification cards because of a commitment to follow government policy, notwithstanding his concerns that elements of such a policy could be inconsistent with the Constitution, our supreme law. He says in his final report, quote, "The Registration of Electors Amendment Bill 2019, which was tabled in Parliament but not passed, had proposed a national identification card. Inasmuch as the 2019 bill reflects government policy, the legislation I have proposed reflects in the main the provision of that bill relating to a national ID card. However, I would be remiss if I did not highlight the following concerns." And Sir Dennis Byron refers to 4 concerns that he has about the national ID card that he is recommending over the voter identification card, which he told us most were in favor of. Almost everyone. National voter identification card supported with biometric data. He says in concern number 4, quote, "Finally, a question arises whether the issue of a card for the purposes unrelated to the registration of voters and elections would be consistent with the constitutional remit of the Electoral Commission. Section 38(1) of the Constitution states as follows: the Electoral Commission shall be responsible for the registration of voters for the purpose of electing representatives and for the conduct of election of representatives and senators, and shall have such powers and other functions relating to such registration and elections as may be prescribed by law, the Constitution, at Section 38. So Dennis Byron continues. The question is whether the promulgation of an act which provides for the issuance and management by the Electoral Commission of a national ID card to persons outside of the electoral system and for purposes which are in the main unrelated to voting and elections would be consistent with this provision of the Constitution. This needs to be explored. End of quote. What does Sir Dennis Byron want to explore? He is a former Chief Justice of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. He's a former President of the Caribbean Court of Justice. He was at the International Criminal Court, I'm told. He is perfectly capable of answering the constitutional question he has raised as to the remit of the Electoral Commission and advise the government accordingly. Instead, notwithstanding the constitutional question he has raised about the Electoral Commission being involved in the issuance and management of a national ID card, he goes ahead and he recommends it nonetheless, because that is what he understands Mr. Skerritt wants. In his phase 1 report, Mr. Byron goes to great lengths, into great detail about using biometric data technology in the voter identification process. But this is not reflected in the actual revised legislation he has proposed to give effect to the electoral reform recommendations. He says in his report, quote, "The Commission has been able to commit to the use of a card for authentic voter identification strengthened by biometric data technology. The leader of the opposition and his team, in consultation with me, supported this development. At the time it was proposed, there would be a voter identification card and that the biometric methodology would be based on fingerprinting. During my consultation with the government, they also supported the use of biometric data to strengthen the process of personal identification, but proposed that the use of facial recognition was sufficient and that to include the requirement of fingerprinting might generate pushback, especially from those sections of the community which associated the taking of fingerprints with criminal investigation." So note well, he wants facial recognition, he wants fingerprinting, fingerprints on the ID card as the biometrics, but the government has taken objection to fingerprints. Mr. Byron says, "I am not persuaded that there would be widespread resistance to fingerprinting." And he says, "Many countries require fingerprinting as part of the application process for visas, and Caribbean nationals readily provide their fingerprints to foreign countries as part of that process." And he says he has research that shows that for decades now, fingerprints have been a basic standard type of biometric information collected by many countries as part of their voter registration process. However, he says, although I'm still of the view that fingerprinting is a valuable biometric in this context, I also appreciate that facial recognition is an effective biometric tool to be used to verify a person's identity. So he's backing away from fingerprinting now because Mr. Skerritt doesn't want it. And he's telling you, well, facial recognition is okay. The draft legislation, he says, contains provisions for facial images to be taken as part of the registration process. Note, the registration process. Not for inclusion on ID cards, for the registration process. The question is whether facial image as the primary biometric would be sufficient to provide certainty of identity in all cases. He has reservations about not using fingerprints as part of the biometric suite, but the Prime Minister doesn't want it, has raised objections to it, and so he has backed away from it. Now, the proposed legislation, the Registration of Electors Bill 2023, from the electoral reform recommendations of Dennis Byron, contain no specific provision for the inclusion of biometric data on identification cards for voting. The Registration of Electors Bill 2023 has 5 references to biometric data. 2 are in clause 2, the interpretation section, where they define biometric data and they define prescribed biometric data. And then in clause 36, there is another reference. In clause 37.1, there's another reference. And in the objects and reasons, there's another reference to biometric data, 5 in all. But none of the references are to the inclusion of this data on the actual ID card for voting. Remember, according to Sir Dennis, the introduction of voter identification cards to persons registered as electors supported the biometric data was considered one of the most important reforms by almost everyone. Clause 11 of the Registration of Electors Bill, which is supposed to mandate the use of ID cards for voting, provides 1, that where a person has been duly registered as an elector, the chief registering officer shall cause a national ID card in the prescribed form and containing the prescribed information to be issued to the person in accordance with the regulations. The chief registering officer may designate locations for the purpose of the issue of national ID cards. That's number 2. And 11.3, there shall be established and maintained by the chief registering officer a roll of the names of persons to whom national identification cards have been issued. So in the law, as proposed by Sir Dennis, there is no requirement for biometric data to be included on the ID card for voting. The prescribed form of the ID card and the prescribed information on the ID card are to be found in the regulation. So let's go to the regulations. Regulation 13 provides 1, the national identification card issued pursuant to Regulation 10.3d shall be in the form set out in 7 and the first schedule and shall be signed by the chief registering officer and have such security features as the chief registering officer considers appropriate. 2, the national identification card shall be made available to the elector who shall acknowledge the receipt of the card by signing or making his or her mark in a book of record to be provided for the purpose. 3, for the purpose of sub-regulation 2, where a person provided an overseas address for correspondence, the chief registering officer shall cause the national identification card relating to the person to be sent to that address by the post. The security features on the card, whatever those may be, will be at the discretion of the chief registering officer. A picture of the card is supposed to be inserted in Form 7, but Form 7 in the proposed regulation of electors regulations gives no indication what exactly should be on the ID card. There is no provision in Regulation 13 for biometric data or any specific information to be included on the ID card. According to Regulation 13, the national ID card must be issued pursuant to Regulation 10.3d. Regulation 10.3d. So Regulation 10.3 states, on being satisfied that the person has met the requirements for registration as elector under the Act, the chief registering officer shall cause A, the person's name to be entered on the register of electors for the polling district in respect of which the application was made. B, a unique identification number to be generated in respect of the person and affixed to his or her application for registration and other registration records. Note, not on any ID card. And C, a national identification card to be issued to the person. Significantly, there is no Regulation 10.3d. You have 10.3a, 10.3b, and 10.3c. There is no Regulation 10.3d. That is the regulation they told us, 10.3d, that is supposed to, against which the, what is it say here? It is supposed to be issued pursuant to Regulation 10.3d, the National Identification Card. But there is no 10.3d. There's 10.3a, b, and c. There is no 10.3d. Significantly, there is no Regulation 10.3d, pursuant to which the ID card must be issued, and there is no requirement in the proposed law or in the regulations to the proposed law for a photograph, fingerprint, ID number, voter registration number, polling district, address to be included on the ID card for voting. In his end of assignment letter to Roosevelt Skerritt, I think Sheridan and Gregoire referred to it. So Dennis reveals he was influenced by Skerritt's expectation that he would assist in resolving the electoral reform deadlock and contribute to the charting the path forward. So he, quote, undertook a comprehensive review exercise to ensure that the work completed would be meticulous and conform to international best practice standards, end of quote. And I'm saying, given the disconnect between recommendations in the Phase 1 report and the actual provisions in the proposed new Registration of Electors Bill, the work in the area of identification cards for voting was far from meticulous, and there is no clear conformity with international best practice. And I'm also saying, in what seems a confirmation of the presence of the he who pays the piper calls the tune dynamic in the electoral reform exercise, Sir Dennis says to Skerritt, and I'm quoting him here again, listen carefully, I recognized that you were concerned about the implication that your government had engaged in improper election practices. I observed that you have categorically and consistently denied all malfeasance allegations and attributed them to the harsh political environment. I wish to assure you, I, Dennis Byron, wish to assure you, Roosevelt Skerritt, that from the outset, I acted on the basis that my mandate did not encompass passing judgments on these matters. Who asked you to pass judgment on these matters, Sir Dennis? Your terms of reference was clear as daylight. Who asked you to cast judgment on these matters? He goes on, I deliberately refrained from seeking evidence on these issues. Throughout the process, I consciously steered clear of party political issues and proceeded on the premise of service to the national interest. End of quote. The reference in here is to improper election practices that the government, he claims the government was accused of. Mr. Skerritt's government was accused of. And Mr. Skerritt was concerned about the implication of that. But the improper election practices, Mr. Byron, Sir Dennis Byron, included what you would have seen from the Commonwealth Observer Mission report after the 2014 election, when it was said that while the election was free, meaning people could have gone to the polls and cast their ballots, it was not necessarily fair because of numerous instances of bribery and cheating, including the transportation of voters from overseas to vote in the local election, and the abuse of incumbency. Who is the incumbent, Mr. Byron? Mr. Skerritt. So when you tell him, as in confirmation of the pact that you had, and what sets up the mens rea for the actus reus, what is in your head while the act is being committed? When you set that up for us in such clear terms in your end of session letter, we, the people of Dominica, are supposed to accept the integrity of your report. When you're telling us exactly what you did, that you were there protecting the interests of Skerritt all along, and the improper practices, including bribery and cheating, where an opportunity presented itself for you to expand and clarify the law so that it is clear that the transportation of voters from overseas to come to vote in elections locally amounts to bribery. You refused to do it because that is not what Mr. Skerritt wanted. You know Mr. Skerritt wanted to continue to manipulate the overseas vote, and so you went to bat for him in the consultancy to ensure that he got exactly what he wanted. And I want to ask the question, how exactly was the national interest as opposed to Skerritt's interest served? So Dennis confesses to Mr. Skerritt, quote, ultimately, I concurred with your assessment that there were few fundamental points in which your government's policies were inconsistent with the other voices engaged in the deliberations. Note this well, you know. there were few fundamental points on which your government's policies were inconsistent with the other voices engaged in the deliberations. I listened to and considered the views expressed carefully. Which views? The views that were inconsistent with government policy. He listened to them carefully. And then he tells Mr. Skerritt, the content of my report varies from some of these views. There's nowhere he indicates where the content of his report varies from the views or the policies of government. The evidence in the report is that everywhere he addresses government policy, he found a way to agree. Whether or not it was inconsistent with the Constitution or not, he didn't care. He found a way to agree because his remit was to give Mr. Skerritt exactly what he wants. Indeed, in the matter of views on voter ID cards, and in every other area of contention, which arose from Skerritt's need for an electoral reform process that can be manipulated to protect his re-election legacy, Dennis Byron came up with recommendations to support Skerritt's agenda. In these areas of contention, there is absolutely no evidence that Dennis Byron conducted his duties independently, impartially, and objectively in the public interest of an electoral process fit for the purpose of free and fair elections with integrity as the backbone of our democracy in Dominica. And so our struggle for electoral reform, genuine electoral reform, that will provide a level playing field for free and fair elections in Dominica, just took an uphill turn.
Yes, and Lennox, thank you for the opening remarks here. Clearly, as you can see, this letter from Sir Dennis Byron to Prime Minister Skerritt obviously was not meant to be seen by people like us. I understand it was leaked from somewhere, but it seems to me if he had meant for us to see it, all of those things would not have been in there. Now, Crispin, here's the thing, right? I mean,
the Lord moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform, Sheridan.
Well, I hope he continues to do that because we need many more wonders, it would appear. Now, Mr. Byron seemed to have, Crispin, given Mr. Skerritt many assurances in that letter. Many assurances. But he failed to consider the question of complying with the CCG recommendations, that we should not have this thing again because clearly it's tainted. I'm just wondering why. And then let us bear in mind, that this report that took 2 years, This is a report that took 2 years to write. If I had given Justice Irving to do that thing, I'm pretty sure I could have got that in 3 months. He probably wouldn't have charged us more than $100. But
I would have probably charged a battery. That's about it.
A battery. That's all right. We'll try to find one for you, even if it's a used one. But the point is that 2 years later, $600,000 later, this is what you get. Assurances to one of the political parties involved in this thing. Remember what electoral this thing is all about, It's about creating a level playing field to get free and fair elections. When you give those kind of assurances to one party to the whole thing, what does that say? I mean, knowing what the CCG has said, the comments that the CCG has made, and you have been a member of that body, you know what is in all of these recommendations made by the international organizations. You know what is happening in the regular legislation that came out of Jamaica, out of St. Kitts, out of Antigua, out of Barbados, for God's sake. And yet, in this report, Crispin, Byron is talking about international best practice that will be the envy of the region. Maybe other people will use it going forward. But I mean, come on, Sir Byron. I mean, really and truly, where are the specifics? I mean, where is they telling us you must re-register everybody? Where is it telling us that, the chief election officer must be taken to task because this man couldn't even take off one dead person from the list in so many years, and you're still telling us to go back to him and depend on him to do what is right? I mean, come on, you're not telling us exactly how much money you think, if any, foreign firms. These people have like big accounts all over the place. Zampoli told us about it. Are you not telling us, well, they should not be allowed to contribute to interfere in our elections so that they control the runnings of our government? We're not even being told that. We make no comment on that. It's as though it's okay. We talk about millions of dollars. Why is it that election in Dominica have to be so expensive? Why do we have to spend millions of dollars? A little country of 70,000 people. Why do we have to have an election, a campaign period that is over a year, 2 years of people, 3 years, people are campaigning and spending all kind of money? You know that the CCJ mentioned all those things that constitute bribery and treating, and you know the laws. I mean, I'm pretty sure Sir Byron knows more of those case laws than Irving Andre. And yet Irving Andre is able to find laws where it says that this thing, when you buy tickets for people to travel and so on, you buy food and drink and anything for them, it is illegal. If Irving Andre could find that, why is it that Sir Dennis Byron could not find those case laws? So, Crispin, I want you to help us out. You've looked at these reforms, the recommendations, the reports. You had a chance to take a look at some of the details of what is written in those laws. What are your thoughts going forward after hearing everything we've heard from Justice Andre and from Lennox Linton? Your thoughts?
Yes. Good evening, Mr. G, and my fellow panelists, Dr. Irving Andre, and Lennox Linton, and Lambie. I should say hi to you. I have listened very carefully to what the two panelists before me have said, and I've been processing what they said and trying to connect it to what I read in these two reports of Mr. Byron. I must say, first of all, that I was always concerned about the integrity of that electoral reform process led by Mr. Byron, because from the outset, we started on the wrong foot, in that it really should have been the Electoral Commission who should have started that process and maybe contracted Mr. Byron.
Yeah, but Crispin, let's not forget that the Electoral Commission started the process years ago, and then that famous email came and it said, listen, madness going on there. Check fellas out. This thing going to mess up that thing.
Right. But the problem is that it even got worse with Dennis Byron being brought into the equation as the sole commissioner to deal with the reform. I felt that what we should have done as a country is look inward, because I believe that there are a number of skilled Dominicans who could have led that process and given us a framework. I think Mr. Byron has tried to give us a framework. He talks about the consultations that he had with Dominicans, the political parties, civil society, certain individuals. But it didn't seem to me that he was able to capture the reality of the context in which we find ourselves trying to forge ahead with electoral reform. The first thing is that you have a government that's been in power for 23 years. That alone is a major impediment to progress on electoral reform. So that's one. The second thing is that having that one person to do all that work. Of course, he read all of the reports of the electoral observer missions, and I'm sure he understands what the problem is. But what he is recommending to us has some serious deficiencies. And the first one I want to address is the financing of the parties. I think it will be an onerous task for any electoral commission to police the financing of parties, because we had the experience. In fact, in Mr. Byron's report, he mentions that in the 2019 election, the Labour Party's budget was something like 26 million US dollars. Now, one wonders, where did that money come from? I know that the Labour Party doesn't even have bake sales, right? I don't know if they sell maybe guava cheese and chicken wings and whatever, but they certainly couldn't have raised 26 million from that. The question is, where did they get all that money from? And they should tell us where that money comes. Now, that question has been posed before, and they didn't answer the question. And up to this day, we don't know where that money has come from. But if you're going to put limits on financing of parties, then the disclosure of who gives parties monies must be on the table. Mr. Byron attempts to do that, but it's really an important endeavor, because already the ruling party has been in power for 23 years. They have amassed significant wealth. They have gotten contributions from people we don't know who they are, and that also included foreign governments. So how do we start policing how parties get their financing? So that's one of my concerns. The second thing that is of importance, and I'm sure that a lot of people who were looking to see what the report says on the absence of from the Commonwealth of Dominica after 5 years. We know that a lot of people who are on the voters list don't reside in Dominica, and many of them have been resident overseas for more than 5 years. That was never a problem until maybe the 2009 election, when significant numbers of voters, their fares were paid to Dominica, which, as has been mentioned before by Dr. Andre, that amounts to bribery. So for a long time, we've had election after election, and bribery has been going on. I think it reached zenith in 2019. And the real issue is who should be on the voters list. I had hoped that one way of throwing the current voters list in the garbage bin was to start a re-registration of voters, so that we would register everybody who is in the country and we'd come up with a new voters list. But that's not what is being proposed. What is being proposed is to reconfirm who is on the voters list. And there's even provision for going outside Dominica to do that reconfirming. And I think that's problematic. So that's a huge challenge right there. And I think that I can say without any reservation that most Dominicans are concerned about Dominicans resident abroad who are not qualified to be on the voters list to be brought in to give the ruling party advantage. And that we know is a very contentious issue in our politics. Mr. Byron did attempt to address the question of media access, but what I find the shortcoming there was that he's only focused on state media. I think that all media should be accessible to all parties in that campaign period that would be established. And I think that a 3-month period leading to elections is probably a reasonable campaign period. And that has to be managed. And the Electoral Commission would have to oversee that the ruling party does not campaign for a whole year, as we saw in 2019. As far as the the registration of voters locally should start immediately after the commission has been reestablished. Now the question is, how do we make that leap to this reform that is being proposed? Right now, it's really in the hands of the government. And the government really should take a back seat and allow the Labour Party and the other parties to sit down and hash this out, because I can't see an electoral reform agenda, a new one, being led by the government for the other parties. That to me just doesn't make sense. That we're talking about all the parties have equal stake in this. So that it cannot be led by the Prime Minister. That is one of the fundamental problems I see in how we move forward. We have a report now. It has some interesting things. It has some problematic areas. But how do we make that next step towards realizing electoral reform? I see that as very vague and worrying, because this thing could really spiral out of control. Mr. G, that's how I see it.
Well, Crispin, thanks a lot for that. I mean, some of the problems that we can see, Crispin, for example, and Irving, you'll advise us on that. It's obvious that it is, in fact, the government, and to some large extent, the Prime Minister, who can table these laws in the Parliament. The political parties can, the Electoral Commission cannot do that. It is the fact the government, the Prime Minister, and the AG, whoever is in there, can put those bills to Parliament. So it is obvious that if he does not get what he wants, this thing may never get tabled in Parliament. The long and short of it is this, that from everything that we have seen from this report and from the past, the statements that have been made from the very inception when the electoral reform process was told, and the reason that was given to affect the Prime Minister's re-election legacy, obviously this is what is guiding him in whatever is happening in these discussions about reforms. Preservation of election winning legacy. Now we have to remember how this election legacy is being won. It's by a largesse of millions of dollars coming into play, tickets and so on, black is white for people. And the excuse I'm hearing these days is that, well, if you buy a ticket for somebody who is in need and you send them down, that is not against the law, and there's case law to prove that. It's like giving somebody a VEP from Marigot to Roseau to vote or something like that. Now, it's obvious from what Dr. Andre has said that there's case law to show that that is totally incorrect. In fact, it is illegal to do that. So here's the thing, Dr. Andre. My concern is, and we're going to take some calls in a minute, Lambi. We'll let you and give out the numbers in a minute. And when we're talking, we'll be able to open the lines and take the calls as they come. But Dr. Andre, it is very concerning that after 2 years, after spending $600,000, which obviously you could have taken that and given it by fertilizer for the farmers, I think we'd have seen a lot more production. You can take a lot of these young entrepreneurs who are very excited and producing all kind of products from using natural resources, and some of them are even exporting now and so on, creating wealth and jobs and income and foreign earnings. You could have given that money to them, because I'm sure the legal draftsmen in the government and in Dominica and Dominicans everywhere would do that for much, much less money than that. So I'm not so sure, Dr. Andre, this money is well spent at all. I'm not sure how good an investment that is. The alternative use of the money could have brought the country a lot more returns. I'm not so sure what returns we have got from this investment of $600,000, because the fact of the matter is there's nothing specific or definitive except in that letter, which we were not supposed to see, which is making a lot of excuses and apologizing to the Prime Minister for not being able to say what exactly I should be saying. But, Dr. Andy, help us out there.
But
Well,
before you go ahead, Dr. Andre, Sheridan Gregoire, it's not 2 years. The assignment started in September of 2020. This month will be 2 years and 10 months. It's almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years. So you see,
first of all, Mr. G, the letter, which was obviously not meant for prying eyes, that is to say, the letter sent by Sir Byron to Mrs. Garrett, it reminded me of a verse in a song, in a religious song. The name of the song is Blessed Assurance. And the particular verse or the particular section of the song, I think, is very relevant and it resonates. And it tells us exactly what's happening here. It goes as this. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long.
well, your
That's
voice
the
not,
message.
your voice
That's
not
the
bad.
message.
Your voice not bad, man. Irving, man. You're better than Lennox, man.
Well, it's not as good as Ian Douglas, for example, but it's not bad. And it certainly doesn't come close to Lennox's thing. So Sir Byron, perhaps, presumably, is inspired by the verse of that wonderful song, Blessed Assurance. So he's given the assurances. I'm delivering what you ordered on your menu. I'm giving you the lobster that you wanted. I'm giving you the fine dining that you seek because you've rejected legitimate reports and recommendations from different sources about the gold standard with respect to electoral reform. You've shown that you have no interest in genuine, honest reforms. What you hired me and paid me such a fat sum of money for one specific purpose, to give you reforms that you seek. So, Mr. G, here's where I differ I part ways from something you just said. Election reforms in the interest of the country. No, that was never the intention. It was election reforms which would perpetuate the legacy, the prophecy of plunder. That is why we're still debating in 2023. Why is it that, unlike all the other islands in the Eastern Caribbean, Dominica cannot have true and honest election reforms? Because what we are seeking, or what the Directorate is seeking, is a panoply of reforms tailored to remain in power. And that's why Sir Byron was giving the person who ordered the report his blessed assurance. That is his sing, that is his song. So that report is his song, and he's praising who ordered him to produce it all the day long. That is where we are.
Lambi, we need to take the people's calls. I think you should give them the numbers. Let's take some calls. But when we come back on the other side here, Lennox, what I want us to do, Lennox and Irving and Crispin, we know what is not in the reports. We know. And we know a lot of things that we would have liked to have seen. The international community would like to have seen. The civic organization in Dominica would have liked to have seen. The political parties would like to have seen. All of the stakeholders would like to have seen. We know they're not there. The specifics are not there. But I think going forward, if Dominicans want electoral reform, they're going to have to stand for it. They're going to have to come out in large numbers and demand it, and to stand there till they get it. It's going to cost money. It's going to mean organization. It's going to mean strength and commitment to stay with it to the end. But it seems to me that's the only way you're going to get electoral reform. And all ideas have to contend. Everyone has to be involved. It cannot be any one group doing this by itself. It's going to be too much. It's going to be too big a task to put an uphill climb. But certainly, when we come back, we need to talk about the things that we need to see in those reforms. and that Dominicans have to demand in those. And it's going to take a petition signed by 10, 15,000 people. We need to have those demands very simply put at what we want. So when we come back, I want us to talk about those things. Lambi, let's give the numbers a call. Let's take some calls.
The Global View and Q. The numbers are 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, 616-4257. These are all local numbers, and the overseas number is 305-432-9624. Let me run those numbers again. 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, all local numbers. 616-4257, also local. International number 305-432-9624. And we're taking your calls right now. We've got two callers on the line. Let's take this first one. Caller, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Go ahead, please. Nothing from that caller. Let's try this one. Go ahead, caller.
Hey, blessings, Lambi, gentlemen, blessings to you all.
Good evening.
And thanks for addressing that situation. Just quickly, my observation. You have something happening simultaneously with Dennis Byron release or submission of the report. The Regional Security Service is exercising or conducting an exercise in Dominica or in the region. That's what Matt told me he find, because about 2 days I'm asking the question, which they offloaded cargo in Layu. There is not a port of entry, and 2 dumpers with government flags were loaded with the cargo, the Coast Guard vessel, a Bajan Coast Guard vessel, offload in Layu. Nobody don't know if they go east, west, or not west. They came from west, east, or north or south. And the Coast Guard vessel went to dock on a port of entry, the the cruise ship berth in Roseau. It's very interesting. But gentlemen, something I just throw that in there, having to do with all this regional government and the CCJ and all of that, can watch a jurist who run the CCJ, as Cabral Douglas said, with all his foolishness that happened and who criticized him. Now Byron come to that conclusion based on an illegal engagement between he and Skerritt. According to Cabral, that's a criminal engagement. What the CCJ, in the absence of somebody taking the matter to court, knowing that, is going to do, independent from whether the oppositions or anybody within Dominica, what Mia Motley, the Gaston Browns, and all of them is going to say, when there are proper facilitation for voting or elections in the country and watching the machination in Dominica, what will be their engagement in mediating or reversing Byron garbage? Thank you.
And thanks a lot for that. Dr. Andre, I don't know whether you can try to answer that question, but what can the CCJ do in the circumstances?
Well, it's a great question from Blessings, quite frankly. And again, I admire Blessings, commentary, and the intelligence he's displayed. And I think he makes a mockery of those callers who reproach him for not going to university, quite frankly. He reminds me of that verse in the scripture where a 12-year-old sat down with the Pharisees and make them look like children. And I think hopefully he inspires others. The fact of the matter is the CCJ cannot really do anything. The CCJ can only do something when the appropriate case comes before it. It's a political question. The question is not what will the CCJ do, but what will the Dominican population do? What will patriots do? I have been very critical of the regional governments. They seem to act as if This is, quite frankly, a club. If you see those old mafia movies, you wonder whether it's not the same type of mentality. They know what's happening. I remember when this fellow Granger in Guyana tried to help himself to the election results. The regional government didn't send the RSS, though. It's too big a fish. They would never send an RRS force to Jamaica. They have their own Jamaica Defense Force, quite frankly. But they will pick perhaps the most vulnerable, Dominica, and send a force on the very eve of an election, a force which was prepared to tear gas a village, not just any village, but the village which just happened to be known to support the opposition on the very eve of a general election. And you have prime ministers traipsing all over the globe, lecturing Africans, talking about climate change. And when it comes to legitimate electoral change, they become complicit in the exploitation, in the evisceration, and quite frankly, in the destruction of Dominican electoral laws. The question remains, what will Dominicans do? What to ameliorate, to change, to correct what the Bajans will never allow in their own country? That's the question.
Well, and I think that's the answer to blessings. I mean, it's really, and Lambi, you can take the calls. It's really Dominicans have to save themselves.
Good evening, caller. Thanks for joining us. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good night, Lambi.
Good night.
And good night to the entire panel.
Good night.
Dr. Andre, I would like to sing the song, but you already sang it, so that's okay. But I called to ask the legal head there. I know Dr. Andre is a lawyer. And maybe lawyers cannot do that, but ordinary people like me, 1,000 of us cannot take these reports and sign a letter and send it back to Mr. Byron, say we don't want that. We can do that?
Of course it can be done.
Well, we can certainly make our views about the report public. And there's nothing as strong as public pressure, public reaction, because these are legitimate voices. These will affect our future. It's not going to affect those who live in Barbados or Antigua or St. Lucia or wherever these folks from the RSS come from. These rules being proposed are going to affect Dominicans. They're going to affect the ability of Dominicans to change their government, the ability of government of Dominicans to ensure that their vote amounts to something, the ability of Dominicans to ensure that, quite frankly, they still reside in a democracy. So the persons most affected by these cynical proposals are Dominicans themselves, even if they don't understand it fully. Many understand, but more need to understand that this is a peril which confronts Dominica.
Okay.
Lennox, the caller is still there. Go ahead, caller.
I have a request to make of Mr. G. Mr. G, the reason why I want to make this request, I'm waiting on your program, is because an elderly lady, 90 years of age, had a surgery. They took off one of her toe. And 3 days later, she could not get antibiotics. One of her granddaughter had to go to Roseau by antibiotics to bring back to the hospital. So these antibiotics could be ministered to the lady by a nurse or nurses. And I said this, even after this happened, the Prime Minister went to visit this lady. And Mr. Crispin, as if that was nothing to him. So I am making a plea now. Listen to Mr. Crispin the other day. I say I'm going to make a plea to Mr. G for us to ban Mr. Crispin on calling the radio station. I think I alone can protest against him because he don't care about nothing that's going on in our country, but all he's trying to do is to spin for whatever he's spinning whatever he's spinning. So I am calling upon you now too. I'm making that request. Let's burn him on the radio station. Thank you.
And thanks a lot. Lennox, I wanted to go to you, because you want to take another call, Lambi? Let's go right here.
Caller, please go ahead. Caller, are you paying attention? Please go ahead.
Yes, I am.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, he has a radio in his background that is he's listening to his radio and not to the phone. So maybe he can call back, Lambi, and engage us. But Lennox, the caller spoke about 1,000 people signing something. But I mean, I believe it will get the attention of every politician in the region. If 10,000 people in Dominica were to sign a petition, specific demands for the reforms that we're talking about, it would send a clear message not only to the party and the incumbent in office, but to the entire region. And clearly, it seems to me that I believe we all had the same conclusion that this electoral reform is not going to be given to anybody on a silver platter. Dominicans are going to have to stand up and demand for it, and they have to insist that they get it. And it seems to me that they're going to have to gather in numbers in order to show that they're serious about it. But Lennox, what I was saying, and I hope let's continue on this thing, what it is that we really want from this, and let's take a call from Lambi, and we'll come back and talk about specifics that we want from this. Lambi, go right here.
Caller, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. Good evening. Boots on the ground.
Good evening.
Gentlemen, you all doing a wonderful job. I'm listening, and I know I'm not the only person listening because education is good for the soul. But there's something that I want to say. And what I want to say is, over the past in the Caribbean, there's a number of things that transpired, and Dominica become the front line. We are one of the first countries that was depending on our agriculture and dump our agriculture for other items that we think we would do better with. And today, we fail. We fail to be able to maintain what our livelihood and our finance earning was to maintain our country. Dominica is one of the first countries that get involved with the CCJ and sign the agreement that the CCJ will be our apparent court. Dominica is one of the countries that signed up with ALBA and become one of the ALBA members that we will fight America and will fight the other Western powers. Dominica now is like the guinea pig
His mic is
of
open.
the Caribbean.
Close it.
And now, with our electoral reform, which is what the world know as when you have to make reform in a country, in the constitution, or in all these high levels of reputable positions, you reform. We want now Dominica to change reform to modernize. And we would like the Caribbean to adopt all what transpired in Dominica. So when this justice come in now, and he's suiting our prime minister with what he wants in order that the guinea pig can remain bearing fruits for the rest of the region, we become the first country that's going to have the type of electoral reform that they're recommending. But this time around, I hope Dominicans are listening and looking at what's happening in the world. There's a war in Ukraine, and today NATO have been standing up together to maintain that Ukraine be a sovereign state. Dominica is a sovereign state. The rest of the region not going to help us to stand up because we are their guinea pig. We are one of the first countries that just cannot develop our financial industries so that we can maintain our country. So they're not going to help us. But the Dominican people, I think this time around, is the time when we need to take advantage of what is happening in the outside world. Donald Trump is facing charges after charges for breaking the constitution. We in Dominica need to stand up and get electoral reform recommended by the best heads of Dominica. We doesn't need any foreign man to come and tell us what we need, because we see all of them using us like guinea pigs. And that's boots on the ground. I'm asking my people to stand up for Dominica. Bye-bye.
All right. So, Lambi, you still want to take another call? Because I want to go in a minute. I want to go over to my panelists to express some specifics here. Let's take another call from you, Lambi.
Yes, let's take this last call. Caller, if you're there, please go ahead.
All right. So it looks like the callers will keep calling, and you let us know when the calls are coming in, and we'll try to enter. But I really want to go over to Lennox now. And I'm going to ask the same question of Irving and Crispin as well. Because it seems to me, we know what is in that report is not making sense for us. It's not going to get us anywhere. All right. It's not going to change anything. Right. It's not going to move the needle in any way. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier, Lennox, I mean, the question of the complete re-registration of electors right there in Dominica. And only Dominicans who reside in Dominica should be on the voters. This whole question of talking about if people visit and so on once in a while, they might qualify. I think this thing should be based on residency. If you either live there or you don't live there, only those residents. The whole question of campaign finance contributions. I think we should come up with some specific amounts that we want to recommend, and certainly whether it's on an individual basis or a corporate basis. And I certainly do not believe that foreign entities and foreign individuals should be allowed to just make major contribution to any political party or candidate to influence the outcomes of our elections and to also influence the performance of our government. And I certainly believe that the campaign period should be no more than 90 days prior to the election day, right? And yes, so let's talk about some of those things, Lennox.
All right, Sheridan, first of all, there are a number of areas that we feel are germane to electoral reform, to having an electoral process that is fit for the purpose of free and fair elections in Dominica. And we've been talking about them for a number of years, and we spoke about them throughout the time of this consultational reform that has led to this report from Dennis Byron. For example, we've been talking about a fixed date for voting every 5 years. We have not gotten that. We've been talking about an accurate register of voters, which to us means total re-registration of all eligible voters to create a new register of voters, and arrangements in law for periodic cleansing of the voters list. We haven't gotten that. We have been asking for re-registrations and confirmation of the voters register to be done by the commission exclusively in Dominica, and for there to be no confirmation of persons on the list of eligible voters at enrollment centers overseas. We have not gotten that. We have been speaking about the disqualification to vote, shifting the basis of that disqualification from absence from Dominica to being not ordinarily resident in Dominica for over 5 years, consistent with the qualification in the Constitution that is for electing representatives, that is based on residence, not being absent from anywhere. We've been talking about voter identification cards with biometric data for all eligible voters who will be obligated to use those cards as identification during elections. We haven't gotten that. We've been talking about clarifying, expanding, and strengthening the rule of law provisions against bribery, treating, personation, illegal voting, election offenses in general. We haven't gotten that. We've been talking about lawful facilitation of registered eligible voters living overseas to vote in general elections in Dominica that effectively discontinues the corrupt, illegal practice of paying millions of dollars from undisclosed sources to transport thousands of voters from overseas to vote and influence the results of election in Dominica. We haven't gotten that. We have spoken about the abuse of incumbency and the need to eliminate it, which requires legal provisions to strictly prohibit using the resource of the state and projects resulting from the expenditure of public funds as campaign tools to corruptly, improperly, and unduly influence voters and thereby gain political advantage. We have not gotten that. We've been talking about media access for the opposition to the news and current affairs programs of all state-owned, state-operated, or state-controlled media in particular, and media in general. We have gotten some inadequate proposals which promote a lot of state-sponsored censorship for access to state media only. Just next door in Antigua, under the Representation of the People's Act, there are clear provisions for political parties and candidates to have access to all media, not just state media. And there are penalties in law for those who don't comply. And that law is 2 decades old. So when we talk now about modernization and we talk about best practice and we talk about us coming now as a shining example for the rest of the region, we trail the region in a number of respects, even with what we have come forward with now in this reform exercise from Sir Byron that we call modernization. We've been talking about campaign finance reform that will provide for declarations of campaign contributions, election campaign spending, prohibition of election campaign funding from questionable sources, and the imposition of limits on election campaign spending by any candidate or political party. We have gotten some fancy proposals, but taken together, those are not going to provide the sort of regulation that will avoid elections being sold to the highest bidder, or will discontinue in some material way the practice of buying influence and buying votes at election time. We've been talking about economic citizens, and we don't believe that those who don't ordinarily reside in Dominica should be, those who do not ordinarily reside in Dominica should be prohibited from voting in election. That has been ignored. And we've been talking as well about election petitions, this business of challenging the results of the election, which is part of the electoral process. And we have advocated for legal provision that will ensure challenges to results filed within 21 days of the election as required by law are concluded within 90 days of the filing. We have some proposals for election petition rules, but nothing that go as far as this. So when you add that up together, we have some real problems. We have some real problems because the very individual who has for years refused to accept recommendations for reform from a number of reputable organizations, including the joint mission from the OAS, the CARICOM, and the Commonwealth that came to Dominica in 2019 prior to the election at his recommendation, at his invitation, in order to advise on electoral reform. They presented their report and it was immediately brushed aside. So for years, in order to protect his re-election legacy, this man has been avoiding and setting aside report after report after report on elections in Dominica, suggesting ways to reform the process. The OAS lamented that 50 plus recommendations that they have made through the years, not one of them have been attended to the point where stakeholders in Dominica ask them, what is the value or where's the merit in you coming back to Dominica to observe elections or to recommend anything at all? So this man who has repeatedly over the years ignored electoral reform to protect his re-election legacy, all of a sudden seems to be anxious about implementing these reforms, which we know on assessment of the Byron report were tailor-made to suit his agenda of electoral reform. The question for the people of Dominica now is, what are they going to do? Because it is the citizens of Dominica that own the electoral process. It is their electoral process. And when you have come through years and years and years of constant denial of reforms that will allow you, the citizens of the country, to have a level playing field on which you can elect government of the people, by the people, for the people. When that right has been taken away from you by a group of government who insist that they and they alone will decide who will serve in government in Dominica, and they tell you they are going to get reform, but the reforms have come back now, and they are all directed to keep this, to maintain the status quo. There's a fanciful proposals. When you get down to the bones of the matter, these are fanciful proposals to maintain the status quo in Dominica, not to promote or to guarantee free and fair elections, not to remove the taints of the process that the CCJ warned us about. And so we have a real problem because the reforms are now proposed by Byron are now in the hands of Skerritt, who seems anxious to implement them, as opposed to his brushing aside all other recommendations that came from him before. And you have to ask why. Why is this man who has brushed aside so many recommendations for reform now anxious to implement these? It is only because he finds them to be in his image and likeness, because that is what they were designed and executed to be. How do we fight? Well, we have to go to the streets. We have to protest. We have to demonstrate. We have to show that this is not acceptable, and we are not going to accept it. It is intolerable. It has gone on for too long, and it is time to fix it. So it is citizen action now. It is time for citizen action to force the issue of electoral reform. Because if it's left to Roosevelt Skerritt alone, he's going straight to Parliament with the recommendations that Dennis Byron has given him in support of his re-election legacy. Nothing more, nothing less. He's not going to change a thing. He's not interested in changing anything. He's just going to go forward, regardless of what the people say they want. He will say, well, this is coming from Sir Dennis Byron. This is the eminent jurist that we have hired. And, everybody was waiting. Now we have the reforms. So now we're going to Parliament. Now I understand why 3 years ago he wanted me to sign an agreement that said we would implement I would join him in implementing the reforms of Sir Dennis Byron, almost like without question. My response at the time was, let me see the reforms. Let the reforms speak, and then we will decide what we're doing. So now we know why he was making that request. He was so confident with what he had arranged with Byron that he knew exactly what was coming back, and we see it now in front of us. So it's now really over to the people. Our responsibility is to provide as much analysis, as much understanding as possible, so that the people know and the people are fortified in the actions that have to be taken in order to force the issue. Without citizen action right now, nothing is going to happen.
No, I certainly agree that you need citizen action, and a lot of citizens have to take some action and take decisive action. But Crispin, when the citizens take action, they want to take action on specifics that they want to demand, and I think Lennox outlined a few of them. Any other thoughts yourself in some of the specifics that are going to be required that the citizens have to demand, including the penalties that would have to be imposed for people who breach the laws? I mean, and certainly I think that the Electoral Commission and the Chief Election Officer have a lot of responsibility to ensure that the laws are respected and everything is done within the confines of the law. This is the role of the Electoral Commission and the Chief Elections Officer. Your thoughts on some of the specifics, Crispin?
Yeah. Well, in addition to those things that Lennox has highlighted, I would say that Electoral Commission reform is critical, and one of the principles that must be adhered to is that no commissioner should be appointed to the commission who has a conflict of interest. I mean, people who are doing business with the government should not be on the commission. So that's one big problem there. Secondly, the accountability of the chief elections officer. When I look at what has happened to that voters list over the last 20 years, you have about anywhere between 15 to 20,000 people on that voters list who may be deceased. And the election office has not been able to remove one. I just find that really a huge problem. So the accountability of the elections office itself, beyond the commission, to get the work done. I don't know if it's an issue of staffing, and I see in Mr. Byron's report he's calling for additional staff of the elections office. The other thing that I didn't talk about before, which in Mr. Byron's report, he does talk about the importance of technology and introducing technological inputs to make the work of the commission and the election office more efficient. And I totally agree with that. But if the commission is not leading, and the commission is really in a vice grip, is stuck, cannot move forward because of the deadlock, and the chairman of the commission, rather than serve, and that's not just this chairman, that happened with the chairman before, they side with the government rather than he ensuring that the independence of the commission is real and consistent with the Constitution. The other thing, Sheridan, is that I feel that Mr. Byron was very careful in his recommendations not to propose anything that would require a constitutional amendment. And I think that for the electoral reform agenda to really be genuine, there must be an amendment to the Constitution. The section of the Constitution that deals with elections may have to be amended. If we're going to have a reform of the Electoral Commission, it will require a constitutional amendment, because the legislation on the commission says that it will have 5 members, a chairman who is appointed by the president, 2 representatives of each of the 2 political parties. That's 5. If we want to increase that, we would have to have a constitutional amendment right there. And I think there are other things that may require a constitutional amendment as regards that whole reform agenda. And Dr. Andre is more versed in the legal side of things than me, but I feel that we should not skirt around that. We really should take the bull by the horn and do the things that is necessary, because it's not just for this current period that we're in. The electoral reform is for the next 20, 30 years. So it cannot be we're just looking now at what do we do to preserve our legacy in power. No, what is best for the country is what the reform agenda should be. Now, the question of the Dominicans living abroad, I totally agree with what Lennox has said, that the voters list should comprise people who are resident in Dominica. No ifs and buts. I see Mr. Byron is skirting around with talking about how many days that you come to Dominica every year, and talking about in that 5-year period, you would have to stay in Dominica for 90 days. That's about 18 days over that 5-year period. And then there seemed to have been some dissension within the commission on that question. So they now said it would be 50 days that you would come. I mean, just why mess with this? To clean that voters list will require a new process, a new exercise of registering Dominicans who are there. From house to house, they get registered. Not, the people who are abroad, they're not resident. They come on vacation. or they go back to their homes in the diaspora. So I think it's time that we put this to rest. And I have to also emphasize that it is the Labour Party that created that problem. I heard one of their acolytes saying the other day that they give tickets to people who can't afford to come to Dominica to vote. Those people, there's so many of these people that they give tickets have not been to Dominica in 5 years. So we need to really end that machination right there and be very, very direct on this. The other thing is on campaign finance. Our elections are too much of a big money venture. We spend millions of dollars. Well, it's really not the opposition forces, it's the ruling party. They spend, can you imagine a budget of $26 million? That's what Mr. Byron has in his report. I don't know how he came up with that figure, but how do you raise that amount of money for a campaign? And then after elections, you have no money. It's just not realistic. On the question of media access, I totally agree that it has to be all media. We're talking about print media, broadcast media, and online media. As we are in this era of online communications, online newspapers should also give access to all political parties and independent candidates who are contesting. I think those are those things I would add to what Lennox has already said.
Okay, now, Dr. Andre, I know you have probably some of the further recommendations that you want to make, but just to comment briefly on the recommendation that Lennox made as regards the fixed date of an election, like Crispin is suggesting, in order to really give this commission teeth and to be able to put the right people on it, you would have to make an amendment to the Constitution. I don't think you could just give the president the total right to appoint whoever he wants, or to just appoint who the prime minister say or who the leader of the opposition say. I think the Constitution something has to be amended there to ensure that it's not almost totally left to the discretion of the prime minister and the president to appoint some of those people, civic organizations that might come on the commission. And secondly, in terms of what Lennox is recommending, most Dominicans by and large agree a fixed date for election. I believe that might also require an amendment to the Constitution. So there are amendments to the Constitution that might be important in order to really ensure that you can give teeth. So when people go out in their large numbers, I think they have to look at the big picture and make a demand for all of those things that need to be done in order to ensure that you'll get free and fair elections. The process has to be transparent and accountable, and there has to be penalties for breaches of this thing. Otherwise, as you asked Dr. Andre, who's going to enforce as it is there now?
Well, you don't have confidence in your DPP. You don't have a confidence in your chief prosecutor, who will nullify prosecute case because it will put the government in the bad. You don't have any confidence in her, for God's sakes. You're right. The Constitution has to be amended. But bear in mind one thing. The need to amend the Constitution has never been more urgent because of the blatant, persistent, and egregious manner in which the electoral process has been perverted to achieve the same result. That is why constitutional reform is so pressing. When you had leaders who were prepared to abide by the Constitution, who did not think there's a need to call snap elections years before it was constitutionally due, who did not try to manipulate the Electoral Commission, who believed that they should have the unmitigated right to be in government in perpetuity. It's only when you have these vices that you realize that there is a need to amend the Constitution. But let me be the devil's advocate. Even if you amend the Constitution, If the political directorate is of the view that no election or no constitution can stop me from contesting an election, even when contesting that election, quite frankly, is prohibited on account of having dual citizenship, when a leader can get away with that, then it is clear that no amount of constitutional reform will ensure free and fair elections in Dominica. The answer, my friends, is leadership. Because if you put a big, fat, ugly snake in a fowl cage, the result is as predictable as you can imagine. The pullets of democracy will disappear into someone's stomach, or should I say into someone's back pocket, or should I say into mysterious accounts. And that is the fundamental problem that we face. Yes, there's a need for constitutional. Bear in mind that Edison James commissioned another eminent jurist, this time with impeccable credentials, to suggest or to recommend ways of changing the Constitution. And among Sir Telford George's recommendations was a mixed system of first past the post and proportional representation. And the justification for that type of proposal was to ensure that no one party will fully control the levers of government, that at least you have a semblance of fairness in the system. But where one entity has no interest in any semblance of fairness, impartiality, or integrity in the process, that, my friend, is the problem. Not the Constitution per se. The Constitution has certain shortcomings, quite frankly, the Constitution of the Electoral Commission. But even if you adopt Sir Byron's recommendations, nothing will change. Plus ça change. Plus c'est la même chose. You have me speaking broken French tonight, Mr. G.
Yes. Well, you
So it
have
is not the Constitution per se. It is those who we've invested with the authority to rule over us. That, my friend, is the fundamental problem.
Yeah, but then, Lennox, I believe it would help, certainly. If one of the things that I know that the UWP, for example, has been recommending for a long time, 2 consecutive terms in office for the prime minister, because you're not burdened or saddled with somebody for 23 years. If that amendment in the Constitution can be made, and it's agreed that there's 2 consecutive terms, that changes the problem. So if somebody is displaying certain characteristics, but still they would not be able to stay there forever and do all the things that they're doing. Your thoughts on that? Your mic.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
First of all, the framers of the Constitution had honorable people in mind, honorable people in public service and providing leadership for the public good when they came up with certain provisions. If they were around today to see what has happened with the treatment of some of these provisions of the Constitution, and to hear people saying that no law and no Constitution will prevent them from doing what they want and so on, they would probably sit down and ponder how they could have worded the Constitution differently. But certainly, we're at a stage right now where we have to consider term limits. And term limits means changing the Constitution. The fixed date for election means a change in the Constitution. And if those who are benefiting from not having those changes now and are using them corruptly to their own advantage, as I said, it is citizen action that are going to force those things to happen. What do the citizens of Dominica feel about voting in elections in Dominica? Who should be voting in elections in Dominica? Who should be on that list? Who should be on that voters list in Dominica? Well, if you consider that something that Crispin mentioned earlier in terms of clearing the list and the necessity of taking off the names of those who have not been in Dominica for a period exceeding 5 years, for example. the fact of the matter is that once the names of those persons continue to be included on the register where they no longer qualify to be on the register, what you have is a clear and present danger to the accuracy of the list, which prevents a very specific challenge to the electoral authorities. Now, granted, the Constitution gives the right to vote to Dominican citizens who are qualified so to do, and that right is to vote for a representative, to elect a representative to the House of Representatives from a particular constituency. And really nobody wants to abrogate or to take away that right. And so the consideration has to be, how best do we give effect to what we need to do to remove the names of those who no longer comply with the length of stay condition, right? So some time ago, in the evolution of this reform exercise, a definition, because getting on the voters register means being ordinarily resident in a particular polling district in Dominica. That's what it means. And so getting off the register through disqualification should not be a disqualification that comes about because somebody is absent. It should be because the person is no longer ordinarily resident. Now, the place of ordinary residence is actually defined in the law, you know. It says, in relation to the qualification of a person to be registered as an elector for a polling district, a person shall be deemed to reside in a polling district in which he or she is ordinarily resident on the qualifying date. That is the definition. So if you're going to be disqualified, it means you must be deemed not to reside in Dominica. And in fact, in the evolution of this new registration of electors bill, there was a time when there was actually a definition of what it means not to reside in Dominica. I'll share it with you because it says, subject to subsection 2, this is 23, section 23, subject to subsection 2, subsection, and subsection 2 says subsection 1 does not apply to a person who is employed by the state on service abroad or to a spouse of that person. A person is deemed not to reside in Dominica if the person, having traveled to another country to live and work indefinitely, has resided outside of Dominica for a period exceeding 5 years, and at the relevant time had not relocated to Dominica to reside indefinitely. And it is immaterial whether the person, A, visits Dominica during that period, or B, intends ultimately to return to Dominica. That definition was actually proposed for the new registration of electors bill. So Dennis Barron decided he didn't want it because it didn't suit Skerrit to have a definition of persons deemed not to reside in Dominica. They preferred to stick with the absence regime, which is inconsistent with the constitutional qualification based on residence. So when they say you're not absent, if you come back for 2 days in the time that you ordinarily resident outside, it means then the clock stopped running on your 5 years of absence. That is absurd because you continue to be not to be ordinarily resident somewhere else, not in the polling district in Dominica. So rather than fix the issue, rather than address the issue as a jurist knowledgeable about these things would do, Mr. Barron decides that he's going to go for this compromise where you would not be considered to be absent from Dominica if you have spent an aggregate of 50 or 90 days. They give the option, 50 or 90 days in a 5, and they're mentioning now in this proposed legislation, or 10-year period. Right? 5 years is 1,825 days. And the absurdity of it is that it's being suggested that if you are here for 50 out of 1,825 days, you will be considered not to be absent from Dominica. That is absolute absurdity. But that is what Mr. Byron has decided to go along with, because that is what he wants. That is what Skerrit wants. And everything, note well, everything that Skerrit has wanted from this reform exercise, Mr. Byron has made sure that he found a way to give it to him in this package of reform measures. That is what has intensified the fight that is ahead of us and the struggle for reform that has taken, as I said earlier, a turn uphill.
All right. So here is what somebody's suggesting. Somebody's suggesting that we give Justice Irving Andre some homework to do. And I know he's pleased because I notice he's smiling. He doesn't even know what the person asking him to do, but you see, he's pleased already. He's smiling already.
That's right.
Yes.
No,
now-
I was just sorry to interject. I was just going to tell Lennox, give the man a chance. The man is just praising his savior all the day long. This is his story. This is his song. That's all.
What do you call it? Precious what?
Huh?
Precious assurance?
Blessed assurance.
Blessed assurance.
Blessed assurance. But Dr. Andre, here is the homework the person is saying they want you to do. I put out some, proposals as to what we want to see in the reforms, that we want a list of things we want to give the patriots, the Dominicans who want to go out there and stand for reform. It's some suggestion of what they want to stand for. Lennox gives some things, you give some things, Crispin gives some things. Somebody's recommending, why doesn't Justice Andre compile a list of all those things and put it in some kind of legal language so that the people who are going to go out there in their numbers, who may sign petitions, this is what they're going to have to stand for, because that's what they want to go to demand, including maybe one or two amendments that will be required to the Constitution in order to give effect, to give teeth to these reforms. Because if you cannot really reconstitute the Electoral Commission, and if you cannot mandate the Chief Elections Officer to do his work, I mean, like just taking dead peoples off the list, for example, right? If you cannot mandate that, it doesn't have teeth. And if you cannot ensure that the Electoral Commission, and in fact, the Chief Elections Officer and his staff, ensure that people who breach the law are either disqualified if the candidate or they're punished in some way, is the same result. So, Dr. Andre, do you think that you're up to the task of compiling this thing and putting it together and then circulate it to all the groups that have an interest, the stakeholders, and see if they can have something everybody can sing from the same hymn sheet?
It's a great idea. I think it's not rocket science, to be quite honest with you. I mean, the principles or the components of free and fair elections are well known. It didn't warrant much research, so Byron could have availed himself of those principles quite easily with the use of his finger for about half an hour, to be quite frank with you. What we're talking about is not rocket science. It's not a mystery. But the fundamental question is simply this. Do your leaders, or do our leaders, have the desire to, in fact, have elections based on honesty and integrity and respect for the people who call Dominica home? That's the ultimate question. But surely the components of free and fair elections are well known, and to the extent that it would assist folks, if it's reduced to a page or two, in terms of what we want or what we expect, then that could very well be helpful. But again, in my view, the major challenge is to get people motivated and desirous enough to see the urgency of this issue, because it's not just about free and fair elections. It governs every component of the lives of citizens who reside in Dominica. I'm in Canada. And, I certainly enjoy the benefits of free and fair elections, of good governance. As I said, during moments of crisis, there's aid delivered by the government. If things become expensive, as they are, groceries, for example, I can go by luxurious stores such as Dollarama, such as Dollar Tree, such as Dollar Branch, all types of discount stores, and I can learn to save a buck. I can go to a boutique which opens only on Saturday mornings and save a few dollars. Lennox, you can smile if you want. The fact of the matter is, Dominicans on the ground do not have these benefits. They do not have much. I spent a few weeks in Dominica recently, and if I'm wrong, one of your leaders will correct me. Virtually everything in the market now is $5, to be quite frank with you. Even the humble pepper from Mrs. Jack's backyard, I suspect a little teaspoon is probably $5 too. So we're talking about something which affects the nature and the quality of life. So this is not folks who have nothing to do talking about going to the polls every 3 years or 5 years or whatever. It affects life in a very fundamental fashion. Let me give you an example, a further example. When government typically intervenes and takes over, for example, a power company, take for example Domlec, they typically do so to provide relief to their citizenry, to bring down the cost. Is that what happened since government took over Domlec, Gasson? I mean, I don't know. I'm just asking. This is not what happened. The prices went up. This is what's happening in Dominica now. Everything it touches doesn't turn to gold. It turns into hardship. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about something which affects the people in the most fundamental fashion. Those who wear the right color, they get their little brown paper bags or more. Those who do not, they get nothing. They're treated as if they have a scarlet letter on their foreheads. And the Pharisees of the day turn their backs and they turn their face in self-righteous hypocrisy. And they condone what's happening in Dominica. That is the reality that you want?
Well, Dr. Andre, I mean, thanks a lot for that. And let's put it this way. Dr. Andre has agreed to prepare, maybe it might turn up be a 1 or 2 page document, brief document. This document, the contents could be the basis for structuring a petition that you can get thousands of people to sign and deliver to the relevant authority and to make the thing look serious. But also it is clear that no one political party, no one civic organization, no one group can do this. It has to be a collaborative effort. Obviously, the political parties will take the lead because they have the bulk of the following, and that's critical mass is important. But organizations like the DPSU, they have a lot of memberships. You have many other organizations in Dominica, all the civic groups, they have followings. And it seems to me that it is time that everybody gets together and decide, we really want a level playing field. We want free and fair elections. We want to fortify democracy. And so I believe, Dr. Andre, if you were to really do this, and it could be circulated to all the groups and organizations, it would be good to see what kind of consensus they could arrive at as to how best to go forward and make those demands. Lambi, you wanted to take a call?
Yeah, we have three callers trying to get in there. Let's take this first one. Good evening, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening. I was trying not to call, but you all mentioned something that made me call. I think now that we have mentioned the Constitution so many times, we need to take a look at how Dominicans think, what Dominicans think about the Constitution. I left Dominica in 1980. I returned in 2018. When I returned, I got 3 documents. One was a copy of the Constitution, which I'd never had before. I left Dominica 2 years after I got independence. The second was a copy of the rules of the House of Assembly. And the third was a copy of the George's Commission report, which someone mentioned a while ago. In that report, the Commission told the government that we are in an embarrassing situation in which we have on our constitution a requirement for a parliamentary commissioner, and we have never appointed one. And we therefore should do so post haste. Now, I understand that that report was never tabled in Parliament, but that's immaterial because this is not a recommendation for amending the Constitution. This is a recommendation to do what the Constitution says. The government did not, for whatever reason, did not take the hint. But more importantly, in the years ensuing afterwards, we have had a number of presidents, each of whom has taken an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Not one of these presidents found it fit to ask the government to be certain that it follows the Constitution and appoint a parliamentary commissioner. But even more troubling is the fact that this very commission, and I don't know whether the drafters had super knowledge or whatever, but in the Constitution, there's a provision which is a backup to the parliamentary commissioner that could have been used to force the government to appoint a parliamentary commissioner, and no one has used it. It can also, now I hear people talk about sham elections. That provision that I talk about could also have been used. It never has been used. So if Dominicans at all levels, from the president to the ordinary man, do not care about their constitution, I'm not sure what hope I can have of something positive proceeding from what we are doing right now. I just thought I would bring it out to us, since someone mentioned the Judges Commission, that we really don't care about our commission. People about the Constitution, people talk about no law, no Constitution. Dominicans have been saying no law, no Constitution for the last 44 years until we educate our people that is wrong. And a mark of order happened. Just see, last week, not last week, 2 days ago, someone was talking to me. We having a discussion, and they brought up to me this talk about constitutional cool wash brigade. And I asked him, where in the Constitution does it talk about that? Because what is funny is that somebody came up with this idea to defend an action that we took in 1979 that was unconstitutional and to excuse it. And nobody in Dominica was able to stand up and say with a certain voice, there is no such thing in our Constitution as a constitutional cool wash brigade. And now there are a lot of ordinary Dominicans who believe that it is a viable thing that we can have. And people listen to people talk, and they believe that is so. And so our lawyers, our presidents, our prime ministers, our opposition parties, everybody has said this constitution doesn't really matter anymore.
All right, fair comment, caller. I can see Lambi is very anxious. He has some callers on hold there. Caller, I think fair comment. Lambi, did you want to try to facilitate one or two of the other callers?
Yes, caller, please go ahead.
Hello, good night.
Good night, sir.
Gentlemen, I joined you late. I was in a meeting, but I was told by someone that the Prime Minister has invited a few persons, an organization, to a consultation tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the State House, so on electoral reform. So my question is this: why would the Prime Minister be responsible for inviting people to have a consultation on the reports when the Commission is the one responsible to manage, supervise, and conduct the business of election on the island? I think the Prime Minister has overthrown and put a coup on the Commission. Is that what it is about? I don't know if you all spoke about that. Or if
I certainly would ask Dr. Andre to address that question. I think he would put it from you.
Coup on the Commission and so on, because it's really out of order. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
call.
First of all, I don't know, and I may be wrong. I don't know if the intent of tomorrow's meeting is a consultation. It could well be. I can tell you that based on my information gleaned from a member of parliament as we speak, I didn't get the impression that the invitation was in response to a consultation. I can indicate, quite frankly, in my respectful view, having had occasion to review a number of drafts, final, I personally think that nothing could be gained through participation in any consultation. The Prime Minister has played his hand. He has played his hand with respect to the type of reforms that he wants. The types of the reforms that he wants are manifested in Sir Byron's report. The type of reforms that he seeks are those reforms that are consonant with the overarching goal, the perpetuation of his tenure in office. So to suggest that somehow the consultations will lead to something positive, something helpful to democracy in Dominica, is, in my respectful view, a colossal waste of time. Nothing more, nothing less.
And thank you for that, Dr. Andre. Lam, you want to take another call before we move on?
Yes, caller, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm back just to clarify. The purpose of the meeting tomorrow is, according to the documentation I got, is to disseminate the drafts that have been given by Mr. Byron. It's not to have any consultation, it's to give it to stakeholders that they can have a copy.
Yeah, that is consistent with my understanding. But in my view, I should indicate that it has been disseminated on social media. I've gotten it from different sources. So I really don't think, other than giving a propaganda victory to the electorate, the directorate, to be quite frank with you, I see no utility in someone who has genuine concerns about free and fair elections in Dominica. I see no utility in attending what is basically a photo op opportunity to say that he was there. He was there, this member of the opposition, this stakeholder was there, so it can't be so bad. That's just my view.
Yes, and Lambi, I think we probably have exhausted our time, and hopefully we've taken as many calls as we could. Crispin, I want to go to you to do your final sort of comments and your wrap up, because obviously, I mean, I think we're ending on a good note in the sense that Dr. Andre has agreed. He put something together, make a list of all his recommendations, because I think what is critical in all of the noise, right, in all of the so-called consultations and so on, what it is they're going to consult about. So if people who have a real interest, real patriots who really want what is best for their country, if we have this guide, right, if all the things that are specifics that we want to see in those reforms, to see in those laws, to see in those regulations, to see in the reconstitution of the commission, to see in the amendment of the constitution to ensure that it gives teeth to whatever final form the electoral commission takes, and to ensure that the chief elections officer does his work, right? And the penalties are there for people not doing their work and not following the law. It seems to me this is what you really need. So the people who are going to go out, whether they're part of whatever organization, or if all the people who together decide, look, we're going to have the will now to get out there, and we're standing up on one platform and singing from the same hymn sheet. This is what we want. We're going to create a petition out of this. We're going to sign this petition. We're going to stand up in front of whoever in their face and tell them, this is what law-abiding, peaceful Dominicans really care about the country. This is what we really want. We don't want what is in that vague document prepared by Sir Dennis Byron. Obviously, that is void of specifics. And it really does not contain many of the things that Sir Byron himself is convinced should be in there. He's making all kind of excuses, ring around roses around the subject because he himself says things that, but he's not putting it in the draft laws that he's recommending. So, Crispin, your final thoughts as we come to close.
Yeah, well, my final thought is that I'm very pessimistic about this whole process. I really, even if Dr. Andre were to come up with this list that we're talking about, how do we get the people who are in parliament today and the majority in parliament to pass the legislation that we want, short of very militant action in the streets? And that's the only thing I see. This has gone on too long, and we're well on the way to a one-party dictatorship. How do we dislodge it now? I'm very pessimistic about the future, and I just hope that reason will prevail, because Dominica's future could really be in shambles if we don't get this thing right.
Well, Dr. Andre put it in a word. He said leadership is what you require to get people out and have the resolve to stand up and get what they want. I think there is a lot of leadership in Dominica. It's just that the leadership have to now come together and decide that they will lead and that they will stand firm. And I think they have to convince the people to stand with them. That is what it's all about. And so I'm hoping, Lennox, that as you make your closing remarks, let's talk about that a little bit, because it seems to me that's what you're going to do.
Well, Sheridan, I want to close where I began, with the admonition of the Caribbean Court of Justice, or Apex Court, that really underlined the importance of the reform exercise, when it said that there remain grave areas of concern with how the process of these 2019 elections were conducted. Future elections in Dominica ought not to proceed with these or similar taints. Our struggle is to fix the electoral process and to make it fit for the purpose of free and fair elections. And at the CCJ itself told us in that very same July 2022 ruling, quote, "Without such free and fair elections, the preambular value of the creation and maintenance of and respect for lawfully constituted authority would be fatally undermined. The consequences of such a denial that a reflection on Caribbean history demonstrates include loss of legitimacy, public unrest, and even revolt. In contemporary terms, free and fair elections are so fundamental to the democratic way of life that without it, the very legitimacy and sovereignty of the constitutional state is brought into question. Constituted as is by the people of Dominica. In this regard, it is worth reminding ourselves the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority, the legitimacy of government." End of quote. This is our fight. This is our struggle. It is citizen action that is going to take us successfully to where we want to go. We can talk. If we don't provide the right understanding, the right explanations, the right motivations for people to take the action that is necessary, we remain as we are right now, in the grip of a dictatorship that has decided it will take away the people's right to elect government of the people, by the people, for the people, and he will hold it hostage for as long as the people decide they do not want to stand and take it back. The power belongs to the people. It is the people who transfer their power periodically to individuals to govern their affairs. And that power should never be taken from the people. And the people should never allow it to be taken from them, which is where we are right now. And we must reclaim it. We have to act together to put Dominica first, to make Dominicans first in Dominica, to rescue our country, to reset our economy, to rebuild our country for the benefit of all the sons and daughters of Dominica. Our country must come first for all of us, and we must come first in our country. That is what this struggle is about. It has taken a decisive turn uphill, but this is not for faint-hearted people. We must go forward boldly together, knowing that we will prevail. We will prevail. Thank you, Sheridan. God bless you.
Thank you, Lennox. I mean, there always comes a moment in history, Dr. Andre, when people have to take stock of where they are at that point in time, where they prefer to be, and to take some decisive steps to ensure that they can get where they want to go to. I'm convinced that there's too much poverty, there's too much mendicancy. There's too much dependency on government in Dominica. That is a bad thing. And when the government stays here for too long, people start thinking, okay, they're almost like gods. They're untouchable. They are our bosses. And they forget that these folks are working for them, that they're paying them, and they're supposed to do their will. They're supposed to work for them and in their best interests. And they're supposed to ensure that these people have the best possible quality of life and living standards, the best opportunity to be able to grow and develop wealth, and to be something meaningful in a society and live in a secure society where there's a minimum amount of crime, where the children can grow up without being abused and molested. Dr. Andre, I'm thinking all those things there. And if people come to that realization, and if the various organizations and groups in Dominica have one document that you propose that you will do, and I hope you can do it as soon as possible, I will certainly maintain contact with you. Not that we want to tax you too much on this, because as you said, we've sort of outlined most of those things over the years, and we know what they are that we want to see there. I would like to see this really in one document and then see it given to all the organizations, and then let the organizations get together and discuss it to see if they want to make amendments to it, and then decide, okay, this is going to be a platform that we can use as a basis for a petition and get 15,000, 20,000 people to sign it. And then to come out in their numbers and to show and to make their demand for what they want, which is good governance, accountable government, transparent government. So, Dr. Andre, your closing remarks, I hope we've done a little bit of work here tonight and that we can see the next steps, what it might be.
Let me say good evening to your listeners and obviously the panelists and their wonderful, tremendous contributions, including the moderator and including Lambie and including Brother Sherwin, who I can't see. Who am I to say what we need? But let me say that we need what has been referred to as servant leaders, servant leadership. Leadership, quite frankly, that is there. Oh, somebody's phone. Somebody, I think Lennox, your thing might be on.
Mm-hmm.
You may have to mute yourself. Right, thanks. Leadership that is answerable to those who elect them. Leadership, for example, that show compassion for the poor, compassion for those we dismiss as prostitutes, compassion for those whose progress in life has not been buffeted by winds of privilege, compassion for those who are seeking a helping hand, not to take care of all their needs, but to empower them to realize their own assets and their own skills and their own talents, to have the pride of working for something and to have the pride for looking fondly at what they've achieved. That is what we need. That is what we should expect. And how can we, in these difficult times, be paying $64,000 a month for rent? How can we, at a time when you cannot find any tetanus injections, whether it's in the Portsmouth Hospital or in the offices of doctors, when you have to go to a clinic and pay $250 for a mild tetanus shot, if you are unfortunate enough to be cut by a rotten galvanized sheet, or if you are unfortunate enough to step on a nail, at a time when those in the political directorate, if they so much get a bobo, they are flown out of Dominica by special transportation to seek medical care elsewhere. How does that square with the type of leadership of someone like Edward Oliver Blanc, to the leadership exhibited in the good book, to other leaders, John, James, even Eugenia, for God's sakes, Pierre Charles? How do we square that type of approach to the history of leadership that we've had? Selflessness, not selfishness. Sacrifice, setting an example. Creating role models for the young people to aspire, not just a few who are successful enough to win scholarships, but the vast majority. Meaningful jobs, a lived wage, as opposed to $800 a month when you are asking for another salary increase at a time when your collective income is over $20,000 a month. Leadership that at least manifests a degree of concern for those who are not as fortunate. Leadership that is concerned about ensuring that Dominicans, their heritage is protected. Leadership that ensures that everyone shall eat, or as many of us receive meaningful jobs. Leadership that shows a concern for persons who have put their blood on the line to work in a civil service and get a decent wage, to be able to get an opportunity for promotion that they deserve. This is the type of leadership that we're talking about. This is not leadership that is divorced from the aspirations and struggles of the majority of the people. This is what we fought for, those of us who were nurtured under radicalism in the 70s. And the unkindest cut of all, Mr. G, is to see some of those radicals of the 70s, to see them at the trough with the etiquette of hyenas, while they look disdainfully at those who are working for an honest day's pay every day. Dominicans have to develop the resolve to change that sorry scheme of things entire, to use some lines of the poet Omar Khayyam. Something must give. That reality cannot exist indefinitely, because it will spell the ruin of persons who do not deserve that type of fate. So this is why this discussion is important. But bear in mind my preliminary comments. There's a time to talk and there's a time to walk. There's a time to speak and there's a time to stand up and say, enough is enough. And Dominicans have to be made to understand and to learn, what time is it? What time is it? I know what time it is. But do Dominicans know what time it is? And I hope for their sakes that they know. Because as I said, something's got to give. I thank your listeners. I hope they take these parting words as words of inspiration, as opposed to words of defeat. Because there's never been defeat in my vocabulary or in the life I try to lead. It's always, what can you do with your God-given gifts and skills and initiative and energy and desire and determination and dedication? And if we all think along those lines, we will be a much richer place than the space that we occupy today. So I thank you for the opportunity to pontificate. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Dr. Andre, for your closing remarks there. I mean, it's clearly you're not going to get this kind of discussion at any of the proposed consultations that we hear bandied about. They're not going to hear that because none of these consultations are going to do anything to try to interfere with this person's election winning legacy. None of them. The only place you're going to hear that kind of discussion, telling it like it is on Q95, you're not going to get it in any other media house in Dominica. Now, here's the thing. Whatever is going to happen in terms of distribution of that document, I mean, this document is widely circulated already. Almost everybody has it who wants to have it, who wants to read it. Those people who want to read it have read it. Lennox has read it, you've read it, Chris, I've read it. The point is, Lennox and y'all, you know that most people will not take the time to go through all of this thing. They're not going to do it. So basically, it's going to be left with talking points given by some politicians in the government, those who want to listen to their government and believe whatever the government says. They're not going to go and read these documents and analyze it the way we have and to realize that it's really worth very little. And in fact, what the work that Dr. Andre is going to be doing there, in fact, that is what the work that should have been done by Sudan. He had the benefit of all those documents from all the international bodies, from all the local groups, civic organizations in Dominica, from the political parties, the church people. He had all of that already. He could have done just that. But then his letter to the Prime Minister certainly revealed everything, why he came up with what he did. And Lennox read the letter and he read the relevant parts of it. He says exactly, well, Prime Minister, well, yes, I'm sorry and so on, but, you know, that's what I can come up with because I didn't want to interfere with your thing, but at least here is something here and there and so on, which, you know, maybe there's something in it for everybody. And if you still need my services again, although my report is done, my work is done, but I'm holding myself available in case you still need my services, I'm still there because, you know, it's a 600, but I mean, there might be more somewhere around there. Hey, who knows? Let's keep the thing open, right? But I just want to say that I think I enjoyed the discussion here tonight, Irving and Lennox and Crispin. I think we really shared, and people who listen, I think I'm getting some good feedback and comments. Some people are saying, look, it is good that we did what we did tonight. What they're saying is that we hope we can maintain the momentum of whatever came out here tonight can be revealed on all the other talk shows going forward, from the other groups going forward, that they can discuss those things in that way to try to arrive at some conclusion on the way forward. So, gentlemen, I want to thank Crispin, I want to thank Lennox, and I want to thank Irving and all our listeners on Facebook and on YouTube. Thank you, Lambi and Sherwin. And thank all of our Q family listeners, wherever you are, in all the communities in Dominica, in all of the countries in the region and globally. I certainly want to thank you all for tuning in and staying with us here tonight. We hope that we will continue discussion. What I would like to do after we receive this document from Dr. Andre, I would like to bring you on the panel, maybe our electoral commissioners, and see what their views are, you know, because they may have some views about the report and they may have some views on some of the things that we shared here tonight. And I would like to have maybe the leaders of the political parties and the civic organizations to come and share their views on what we expressed here tonight, to see if everybody can sing from the same hymn sheet. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you and good night to everybody. Lennox.
Thank you.
Thank you. God bless
you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
And I hope Dominica is safe on Thursday with the anticipated storm that is approaching.
Well, yes, that is crucial. Not only on Thursday and Friday, but there seems to be another little formation coming its wake right after it. We hope that dissipates and that it does not really create any severe impact. So my understanding from the predictions are that by Friday it should be with us, but it might be at about 75 miles per hour. We hope that is not strong enough to take away roofs and sun, but certainly we know we'll get some rain. And I hope our people are prepared to, you know, protect themselves from some of the water that might seep into the houses. But I really wish everybody well. And like you, Dr. Andre, I hope everybody tries to remain safe and sound from this.
Yeah, everybody should remain safe and sound. This is our story. This is our song.
This is our song.
Yeah.
It's very well put.
It's not the other song. What's the name of the other song, Dr. Andre?
The same blessed assurance.
Blessed assurance. It's not that
one. Praising my master every day.
All day long?
All the day long.
Oh, not in the night.
Keep it real.
No comment.
All the best.
Good night. All the best,
Okay.
everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Take care.
Okay,
All
bye.
right.
All
Take
right.
care. All right.
Oh, na 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 na. Oh, na 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 na. Oh, na 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 na. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, looking out my window, and I'm a thinking of tomorrow, and I'm a wondering what the future will be. Thinking of the children who are the victims of oppression, beaten down by wars and eaten up by starvation. I'm saying, when there's ugly will be over, and the children can go out and play. I wanna see when all oppression will be done, and the people will rise up and say, freedom at last, freedom at last, so free, freedom has come, freedom has come, oh yeah. Sitting in seclusion, I'm in my meditation, and I can hear the voice of the sufferers cry for justice. Ooh, another ugly war is raging, threats of nuclear war is rising, and the world is gripped by fear of mass destruction. I'm saying, when there's ugly will be over, and the children can go out and play. I wanna see when all oppression will be done, and the people will rise up and say, freedom at last, freedom at last. So free, freedom has come, freedom has come, oh yeah, oh yeah. So much blood, sage and sorrows. There is no future for the youths of tomorrow. Yeah. So many mothers crying, so many funerals. Oh, when we lead it, when there's only will be over, and the children can go out and play. I wanna see when all oppression will be done, and the people will rise up and say, freedom must go.
With me, Rob Walker. In today's programme, the story of a Somali Air Force pilot who faced a terrible choice: either bomb civilians in his own country or refuse and face the prospect of being shot.
The fighting is between the government and the main rebel grouping, the Somali National Movement. Since 1981, they've been opposing the military dictatorship of President Mohamed Siad Barre.
In May 1988, rebels from the Somali National Movement launched a series of lightning attacks on the main towns in the north of Somalia.
Tonight, there's confusion over just how far the SNM rebels have advanced. Certainly, the radio station went off the air.
By this point, the president, Siad Barre, had become deeply unpopular, and to hold on to power, he'd increasingly relied on support from his own clan. But at the same time, he'd also systematically discriminated against the main clan in the north, the Asak, and that had led to the rebellion by the SNM.
These pictures, shot on the rebel side, show members of the SNM moving freely in several areas of Hargeisa, the biggest town in what was once the British-ruled part of Somalia.
By the beginning of June 1988, the rebels had taken control of most of Hargeisa. The government forces fell back to the airport, and as they did so, they were ordered to begin the indiscriminate destruction of the city. That meant planes taking off from Hargeisa airport and then turning straight back round to bomb the city itself.
Ahmed
Mohamed Hassan was a fighter pilot in the Somali Air Force at the time, and he was based in the south of Somalia.
I was following what was going on. I was hearing on the radio about the planes operating out of Hargeisa airport. But then I was ordered to be part of it myself as well. And I was given 4 days' notice that I was being sent to Hargeisa. And so I started to think about how to avoid it.
And if you were to say at that point to the government, I don't want to go to Hargeisa, I don't agree with what's going on, what would have happened to you?
Well, that would be unthinkable, because to refuse an order was to be shot, and for them to shoot someone meant nothing to them.
A few days later, Ahmed and another pilot were ordered to take 2 MiG-17 fighters and fly together to Hargeisa to report for duty.
We arrived in Hargeisa between 4:30 and 5 p.m. I could see many parts of the city on fire. It was continuous artillery shelling and then the planes attacking, non-stop, one after the other. How could they do this and do it to their own people? I couldn't understand it.
An American aid official who's just visited Hargeisa says a quarter of the town lies in ruins.
The following morning, we were taken to the military headquarters, me and the other pilot I'd arrived with. We were then told that our mission was to bomb Hargeisa, but it was known that there were civilians still in the city. I felt just a sense of horror.
Later that day, Ahmed and the other pilot were ordered to begin their first attack on the city, and the two of them took off together from Hargeisa airport.
We would always fly together, ascending as a pair. But as we circled around Hargeisa, I called in to report that there were some problems with my plane. The air pressure was low. So I asked for permission to land and I returned to the airport. The other pilot flew on and continued his mission, and he shelled the city.
Ahmed says this issue with his plane was in fact one he'd already known about before he arrived in Hargeisa, but as it wasn't immediately dangerous, he decided not to tell anyone in case he later needed an excuse not to fly. And so this is what he now used as the reason to abort his mission and avoid having to fire on the city. And so what did you do then? Did you make a report to your superiors about the problem with your plane?
Yes, an engineer was assigned to work on it. But that evening, there was a lot of talk at the barracks, saying things about me like, he doesn't want to fight, and things like that. But they did not have any real proof. So it was left for the next day to see if this was true or not.
That night, Ahmed's plane was made ready to fly, and he knew he was now out of excuses to avoid bombing the city. The next morning, Ahmed and the other pilot once again taxied together along the runway.
When we were both ready, we took off together as a pair as normal, and as we climbed, He was ahead of me as usual. We reached a height of 500 meters, and normally 500 meters is the height the bombs could be dropped at. But I continued to climb up and up.
By this point, Ahmed had already made a decision. His only alternative to bombing the city, he realized, was to flee, to fly north across the border into Djibouti. But what he hadn't worked out was where he was going to land when he got there.
I turned to the direction of Djibouti, and then there was cloud cover, which meant I couldn't see the ground. And I didn't have any navigation systems at all. All the time I was in flight, I couldn't see any land. So when I thought it was about the right time, I started to descend. Then I saw I was at a place called the Tajura Gulf on the coast of Djibouti. I passed the city of Djibouti. Then I turned around, and on my way back, I saw the emergency low fuel light had come on. So I descended straight away, and I saw a small, clear area where I thought I could land on a stretch of beach. It's called a forced landing, and there's a procedure to follow. You have to throw off the canopy hood so that you can quickly leave the plane. And when you descend, and the plane is touching down, you have to touch down in a stalling manner. And I did all of that, and I landed safely.
Ahmed had landed on a beach on a desolate and uninhabited stretch of the coast, and now found himself completely alone. Just him in his flight suit, standing next to his MiG-17 with no one in sight. Eventually, though, he met two rather surprised fishermen, who the next day took him by boat to Djibouti City, the capital. Ahmed had reached safety, but he knew there was now no way of going home.
I had a family, 3 children and a wife, my parents, my siblings that I had left behind in Somalia. It was difficult. My oldest child was 3, but it was a choice between 2 evils. Either kill people or escape to Djibouti.
Back in Hargeisa, meanwhile, the violence had continued. By the end of July 1988, Somali government forces had pushed the SNM rebels out of the city. But by this point, it had been almost completely destroyed, along with Burao, the other main city in the north. And government troops had also carried out mass executions of civilians, targeting members of the Isaac clan. In all, it's estimated that more than 50,000 people were killed.
Most of Hargeisa's estimated population of 250,000 have sought refuge initially in the surrounding countryside, and the result has been a massive exodus across the border into Ethiopia.
Over the next few years, civil war in Somalia intensified. In 1991, the government finally collapsed. And in May that year, the SNM rebels unilaterally declared the north independent as the Republic of Somaliland. Ahmed, meanwhile, was able to reunite with his wife and children and start a new life in Luxembourg. In 2008, he made his first visit back to Hargeisa and was able to see a city that had been rebuilt. And Ahmed, you probably know this, but many people in Somaliland see you as a hero.
I cannot be called a hero. People are giving me what I don't deserve. I saw it as my duty.
Ahmed Mohammed Hassan, the pilot who refused to bomb Hargeisa, was talking to me, Rob Walker, for Witness History.
This is the BBC World Service, where we tackle the long-running and the latest stories that affect our lives.
In The Explanation, we look beyond the headlines so we can understand our world better. In this episode, we look at warfare in the 21st century. What is the Russian mercenary organisation, the Wagner Group?
The Explanation. Sunday at 10:30 GMT. In half an hour, Fukushima.
In episode 4, the stricken power plant is in meltdown and pressure levels are dangerously high, making the chances of another explosion all but certain. As the plant manager evacuates younger members of staff, teams are dispatched to vent the unstable reactors.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 3 o'clock GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. Rescuers are racing to find the missing submersible near the wreck of the Titanic.
The Coast Guard has coordinated search efforts with the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guard, Air National Guard aircraft, and the Polar Prince, which has searched a combined 7,600 square miles, an area larger than the state of Connecticut.
The vessel's thought to have just over a day's worth of oxygen left. We have the latest from the search headquarters in Boston, also on the newsroom.
I'm very proud of my son.
President Biden's son Hunter secures a plea deal to avoid jail time on minor gun and tax charges. A fight between rival gangs at a women's prison in Honduras has left more than 40 people dead. And later,
Lisbon is a great place where you can have the benefits of a city, but also be able to escape very quickly.
Like in Europe, it's kind of a cheap country to live in.
we report on the digital nomads moving to Portugal. First, this update.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The operation to find a missing tourist submersible near the Titanic wreck is expanding to include more resources and private companies with expertise in deep-sea rescuing. The US Coast Guard says the 5 people on board now have less than 40 hours of oxygen left. A Coast Guard spokesman, Captain Jamie Frederick, said there's a huge effort being made to get heavy equipment to the search site.
There are several civilian ships that have offered services heading that way. There are additional Coast Guard cutters. We hope to have a Canadian Coast Guard cutter on scene this evening. We hope that they may be able to assume on-scene commander. Polar Prince has been doing a great job with those duties, but if we could take some of that from them, that would be good. I'm not going to get into talking about specific equipment. Frankly, I'm not an expert on what that equipment is, but we have experts in the Unified Command that are going through that, prioritizing what we need and then how we get it on scene.
The police in Honduras say more than 40 people have been killed at a women's prison during a clash between rival gangs. Reports say one of the gangs locked rival gang members in a cell and set fire to it. It's thought 25 inmates burned to death. Others were shot. Honduras has a history of deadly prison incidents, often provoked by gang violence. Palestinian gunmen have killed 4 Israelis and wounded 4 more near a settlement in the occupied West Bank. Yolan Nell in Jerusalem has the details.
According to an Israeli military spokesman, 2 Palestinian gunmen opened fire in the forecourt of a petrol station and a roadside hummus restaurant close to the Israeli settlement of Eli. One was shot dead by an Israeli civilian at the scene, he said, while the other escaped in a stolen car but was later found and killed by Israeli forces. Both gunmen are said to have come from a village near Nablus and to have been affiliated with the Islamist militant group Hamas. A spokesman for Hamas didn't claim responsibility for the shooting, but said it was a response to an Israeli military raid in the northern West Bank city of Jenin a day ago, in which 6 Palestinians were killed and dozens wounded.
President Joe Biden is meeting experts in San Francisco to discuss the promise and pitfalls of artificial intelligence. Mr. Biden told the gathering that there was a need to manage the risk AI poses to national security and the economy. He said we'll see more technological change in the next 10 years than in the previous 50. He also spoke about the dangers of AI on social media.
Social media has already shown us the harm that powerful technology can do without the right safeguards in place. That's why I said at the State of the Union that Congress needs to pass bipartisan privacy legislation to impose strict limits on personal data collection, ban targeting advertising to our children, and require companies to put health and safety first.
In February, President Biden directed US federal agencies to promote balance in their use of new technologies, including AI. This is the World News from the BBC. The US Senate has confirmed the nomination of a prominent pro-abortion lawyer to the Federal Appeals Court in Boston. Julie Reichelman argued on the losing side of the landmark Supreme Court case last year that ended a half-century of national right to abortion. President Biden nominated her a month after that decision. Western Australia is bringing in new laws to fully decriminalise abortion. They propose a raft of changes to the current abortion laws, some of the oldest in Australia. Phil Mercer has this report.
Medical staff or patients can face prosecution for ending a pregnancy that doesn't meet strict legal requirements. New reforms aim to fully decriminalise terminations. Later term procedures up to 24 weeks would be permitted. The current limit is 20 weeks. Mandatory counselling and the need for a doctor's referral would also be abolished. The Western Australian government says its new law will improve access to safe and timely care for patients. Some church groups have strongly opposed the changes.
Peruvian police have arrested a former prime minister for allegedly conspiring against the state and joining an attempted coup by the ousted president Pedro Castillo. Betsy Chavez was detained at her home in the southern city of Tacna. She's denied having knowledge of the alleged coup. Other former ministers of Mr. Castillo's government are under investigation for fomenting rebellion. The largest US newspaper chain is suing Google for allegedly monopolizing ad technology for the online advertising market. In a complaint filed in Manhattan's federal court, the Gannett Group, which owns more than 200 daily newspapers, accused Google of controlling tools for buying and selling online ads. Google has argued publishers have many options for advertising technology and keep the vast majority of the revenue. That's the latest BBC News.
Thank you. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with Oliver Conway. It is now 63 hours since the Titan submersible began its dive to the wreck of the Titanic, meaning it should have just over a day's worth of oxygen left. Communication with the craft was lost less than 2